If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 281 Murals. Deep in the passage, a dangerous possibility? Honestly, Jengar had always thought its shadow abilities were pretty impressive. Phasing through walls as thick as this passage, pulling Kairos into the shadow realm alongside it, that was no small feat. But standing here, looking at the creature before them, it felt thoroughly outclassed. Just the ability to project power outward and hold a stable, sustained barrier, that alone put this thing on a completely different level. There was no comparison to be made. Kairos patted Jengar on the head and motioned for it to pull back into the shadows for now. The barrier had cut them off from the surrounding environment, but danger hadn't gone anywhere. If things went sideways, the shadow realm was the safer place to be. Jengar rolled its eyes and melted back into the darkness, leaving only a pair of watchful eyes peering out from the black. The group moved deeper into the passage. The further they went, the worse it got. Even inside Marshadow's barrier, Kairos could feel the oppressive energy pressing in around them, steadily building with every step. The air had thickened into something almost liquid. The barrier held back whatever was lurking in it, but the psychological weight crushing down on his chest was a different problem entirely. The walls had changed. The smooth stone was gone. Strange textures crept across every surface now, patterns like the veins of something living, faintly pulsing, giving off a dim violet glow. Kairos stared at them and felt a chill crawl up the back of his neck. There was a massive concentration of soul-eroding mist here. And not just that. The mist felt fundamentally different from what they'd encountered outside. It looked like ordinary fog to the naked eye, but Kairos could sense the truth of it. His perception was sharper than he expected. This was a high-density energy aggregate, laced with surging psychic and ghost-type forces all knotted together. No wonder Marshadow had been holding the line here. The concentration in this passage was far beyond anything outside. Even a light source at Chandelure's level would struggle to make a dent against this. Without Marshadow's barrier, anyone who stepped in here would be swallowed up within a few paces, reduced to a dried-out husk somewhere in the corridor's depths. Kairos glanced over at Chandelure, floating at the front of the group. Its flame had dimmed noticeably. It had pulled the fire tighter, conserving every bit it could. He exhaled quietly. The depths of the ghost world were every bit as brutal as the stories had always made them out to be. He was still scanning their surroundings when something on the stone wall ahead caught his eye. More mural fragments. These were in far worse shape than the ones from before. Large sections had peeled away entirely, leaving only faint outlines and smears of color. He moved closer, trying to make out what had been there. Unlike the earlier murals, there was nothing here about Giratina. But the artistic style was unmistakably the same, that same ancient, archaic quality suggesting they'd come from the same hands. The damage was so severe the images barely made sense. One section showed only a single eye. Another, half a wing. A third was nothing but a tangled mess of indecipherable lines. Kairos stared at the fragments for a long moment and came away empty. Whatever they'd depicted, it didn't seem to connect in any obvious way to Giratina. He tried to piece something together and eventually gave up. The murals looked deliberately destroyed, and thoroughly at that, with almost nothing left to read. Then a thought struck him. He turned to look at Will, who was walking just behind him. Will was scanning the surroundings with tightly focused attention, clearly on high alert. When he caught Kairos looking at him, he tensed up immediately. "What is it, Kairos? Something wrong?" Kairos shook his head and nodded toward the murals on the wall beside them. "Do you know anything about the origin of this passage? You know so much about the ghost world. You must have looked into this place at some point." Will glanced at the mural and let out a quiet sigh. "Its origin? Honestly, we're not entirely sure. According to what's been passed down through our ghost world lineage, this passage wasn't built by us, and it wasn't carved out by ancient humans either. It was already here when the ghost world came into being. So it formed naturally." Kairos pressed. "Not exactly." Will shook his head, a note of uncertainty in his voice. "It looks like a natural cavern, but those smooth walls, those murals, they've clearly been worked by something. We've always suspected this was left behind by something far older. Something that may have existed here before the ghost world itself was born." Kairos took that in quietly, turning the idea over in his mind. After a moment, he asked another question. "Do you know how the ghost world came to exist in the first place? Why does this space exist at all?" Will blinked, clearly caught off guard by the sheer scale of the question. He gave a rueful smile and spread his hands. That I genuinely don't know. It's too far back. So far back that even the oldest legends have gone hazy. All we know is that one day the ghost world was simply there. Like a bubble rising suddenly through water, it just materialized, as if from nothing. Just appeared. Kairos rubbed his chin, thoughts already starting to form. That was a fascinating detail. If it had appeared suddenly, the ghost world wasn't a natural product of this world. It was more like an intruder, an alien dimension that had been forced into existence here. It only reinforced what he'd already started to suspect. The ghost world might not belong to this world at all. It could be an independent space, or maybe a projection from some higher dimension. It was even possible it had some kind of connection to the parallel world where Marshadow had originated. His mind moved fast, one thought chasing the next. If the ghost world truly was something from outside this world, then what about the entity sealed within it? Could that be from somewhere else too? That train of thought pulled him back to the shattered murals he'd just been looking at. He turned to Will again. Do you know anything about the murals in this passage? They're barely readable now, but your people must have investigated them at some point. Were there any records? Any theories? Will nodded slowly, his expression turning somber. We did investigate them. Even with how fragmented they were, we cross-referenced what remained against other surviving symbols. What we found suggested that the images in these murals very likely depict the entity sealed at the heart of the ghost world. Kairos felt his heart jolt. The murals show the thing that's sealed in here. Yes. Will gave a firm nod. We believe so. We couldn't make out the full picture, but based on the features we could identify, we're fairly confident. Kairos stood still for a moment, letting that sink in. He turned the implications over carefully. If Will was right, things had just gotten considerably more complicated. The mural fragments from earlier, even without a clear full image, had carried an unmistakable stylistic resemblance to the murals depicting Giratina. If the sealed entity was truly the subject of those murals, then that would mean. The hair on the back of Kairos's neck rose. Please don't let it be what I'm thinking. He gave himself exactly 1 second of silent prayer. Please just be some ordinary ghost type. Even a powered-up Bullenvite would be fine. Anything but that. Because if it was the thing depicted in those murals, the smart move was probably to turn around, go home, and pretend none of this had ever happened. Even those partial fragments had carried a crushing, suffocating weight, an aura so heavy it was hard to look at directly. Kairos knew exactly what that aura pointed to. Giratina. The sovereign of the distortion world. The legendary beast said to move through time and space, to bend the fabric of reality itself. Its power put it in Arceus territory. In the game world's lore, Giratina had always been a figure of profound mystery and danger. The distortion world it commanded was a dimension mirroring the real world, governed by rules and forces no ordinary mind could wrap itself around. In a world like this one, that power would be stronger, not weaker. If Giratina had actually been sealed here and was on the verge of breaking free, Kairos didn't even know where to begin thinking about what came next. Forget him. Even if you gathered every champion in the region, every gym leader, every Elite Four member, and threw them all at it together, they still wouldn't land a meaningful hit on Giratina. This wasn't a gap you could close with numbers. This was the kind of absolute, categorical difference that no amount of effort could bridge. Kairos drew a slow breath and forced himself to calm down. Still, his gut told him it probably wasn't Giratina. Because if it were, Marshadow would have been long gone. It certainly wouldn't still be here, calmly negotiating terms with them. And that earlier mural, the one actually depicting Giratina, had radiated an overwhelming presence, yes. An almost unbearable divine authority that made it difficult to hold the painted image's gaze. But that feeling was closer to majesty. An elevated, godlike quality. Not raw, primal dread. There had been no sense of malice in it. It had felt like a stern judge. Not a frenzied destroyer. The entity sealed here, based on everything Marshadow had described, was clearly driven by destructive impulse and hostile intent, something more like those paradox Pokémon from before. The natures simply didn't match. Of course, this was all just speculation on his part. In a world this full of unknowns, anything was on the table. Perhaps there was a possibility of Giratina becoming corrupted, it was hard to say. Kairos shook his head and scattered the spiraling thoughts. No use dwelling on it now. He'd only end up scaring himself. Whatever lay ahead, they had to push forward regardless. One step at a time. He lifted his gaze to the passage still stretching out in front of them and wondered whether the Legends and Faith module would unlock in the next 2 weeks, and whether it would give him anything useful when it did. Come on. No point standing around. He clapped Will on the shoulder and gestured for him to keep moving. Whatever's waiting up ahead, we need to go look. It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing. We might be watching history happen right now. Will gave a pained smile, clearly not sharing Kairos's optimism in the slightest. But he nodded, tightened his grip on the pokeball in his hand, and fell into step. The two of them pressed deeper into the dark, one after the other, under the protection of Marshadow's barrier, moving toward whatever was waiting for them at the end. The passage narrowed. The air around them grew colder. It wasn't a temperature drop. It was the kind of cold that didn't come from the body at all. A chill that radiated from somewhere much deeper. Something was watching them from the dark. Watching quietly, without moving. Kairos felt it crawl up his spine. He didn't look back. He just kept walking, one step at a time. Ahead, in the darkness, a faint red glow began to bleed through. It was dim, barely a glimmer. But in the total blackness of the passage, it was stark and jarring, like a wound cut open in the dark. Marshadow went still. It floated there, staring at the red light. When it finally spoke, its voice had dropped to something unusually grave. We're almost there. It exhaled slowly and turned to look at Kairos and Will. The area ahead is the core of the seal. The rules governing everything inside have been warped. Stay close to me at all times. Don't wander. Kairos gave a single nod and pulled in a deep breath. Will swallowed hard. The color had drained from his face. The passage had reached its final stretch. The deterioration around them had been worsening with every step, and now even the walls that had still been barely legible were eaten so far through that they were unrecognizable. The stone had been corroded into something lumpen and grotesque. Will swept his eyes across the pitted, gouged surfaces and his brow pulled tight. The soul-eroding mist concentration here was staggering, as if every last bit of mist in the region had been compressed into this single, confined space. The rock that had once been solid now looked disturbingly like rotting flesh, sagging and crumbling, weeping slow black liquid from above. Will stared at the scene and couldn't hold back the unease twisting through him. If he'd come here alone, he wouldn't have stood a chance against mist at this concentration. There would have been no question of going deeper. His psychic power would have been shredded apart the moment he reached this point, leaving him nothing but a hollow shell still wearing a human face. No wonder Marshadow had refused so absolutely to let him through before. This place was a death trap. The dread settled heavier in his chest. If the entrance to the passage already looked like this, what would the depths be like? Just how terrifying was the entity sealed inside? The more he thought about it, the hollower he felt. His footsteps grew heavier without him meaning them to. But beside him, Kairos wasn't paying the mist any attention at all. His eyes were fixed entirely on the walls. More precisely, on the murals carved into them. There were more here than before. Just as damaged, but unmistakably the same style. The same subject matter, it seemed. What struck Kairos as strange was that the murals appeared completely immune to the mist's corruption. Everything around them was rotting. Everything was crumbling. And yet the murals remained intact, untouched, still etched cleanly into the stone, faintly shimmering with a dim black radiance. Chapter 282 What do you mean not that scary? The light was faint, but in a place swallowed entirely by black mist, even a dim glow was hard to miss. Kairos moved a little closer and studied the glowing lines carefully. These murals really were part of the legendary ruins, preserved by some special force that kept the mist from eating away at them, physically and energetically both. That settled something in him. At the very least, it meant whatever civilization or power had once existed here had been capable of standing against the soul-devouring fog, capable enough to ignore even its densest concentrations without much trouble. If it had been done before, maybe there was a way to do it again. While he was still examining the murals, Marshadow, who had been leading them forward, suddenly stopped. It turned back to look at the two of them, and its expression had gone unusually serious. The path ends here. It drew a slow breath and pointed toward the pitch-black void ahead. Once we step out, we're in the core of the ghost world. Both of you, listen. Get your breathing under control now. The moment we're outside, no matter what you see, hold your breath. Don't go gasping for air. Will blinked, caught off guard, and asked without thinking. Hold our breath? Why? Marshadow shot him a look. Isn't it obvious? The air out there is saturated with high concentration mist. Start breathing deeply and your brain will shut down on the spot. I have a barrier up, but the moment we step out, the initial impact is at its peak and the barrier might waver. Watch yourselves. Though given your combined strength, something like that shouldn't take you down. Kairos heard that and immediately took several long, slow breaths of the relatively cleaner air around them, let it out steadily, then held the last one in. Will saw him do it and didn't waste a second following suit. Once they were both ready, Marshadow gave a short nod. Ready? Let's go. The words had barely left its mouth before it swept one hand forward and launched all three of them out through the end of the passage. Black mist surged up on all sides. In that instant, Kairos felt his vision tilt, as if he had been squeezed through a narrow tube and suddenly hurled out into open ocean. Then the impact hit. The soul-devouring fog was everywhere at once, savage and absolute. It crashed toward them like a wall of ravenous mouths, screaming as it surged forward, desperate to swallow them whole. The density was far beyond anything they had felt at the end of the tunnel. The green barrier Marshadow had conjured shuddered violently, letting out a grinding shriek that set teeth on edge, as though it would shatter completely at any second. Will's focus sharpened and he moved on instinct, hand already reaching for the pokeball at his waist. He was ready to release his Jengar to help shoulder some of the pressure, because at this level of impact, Marshadow alone might genuinely not hold. But just as he was about to act, Marshadow raised one hand and the light coming off it suddenly dimmed. The bright green barrier dropped in an instant, turning a color that was almost transparent gray. Then something extraordinary happened. The soul-devouring fog that had been crashing toward them in a frenzy suddenly stopped, as if it had lost its target entirely. It hung suspended in the air just outside the barrier, drifting in slow circles, searching for something it couldn't find. Then, like a tide going out, the roiling fog slowly pulled back, as if the three of them had simply ceased to exist. Will stood frozen. He stayed in his ready stance without moving, and it took him a long moment to process what he had just seen. What had that been? Why had the fog just left? Marshadow let out a long breath and wiped at a non-existent sheen of sweat on its forehead. Phew! That was a little close. It glanced back at the two of them, still staring, and its tone carried a note of exasperation. Sorry about that. I was a little rusty coming out. The barrier's energy fluctuated more than it should have. If it had taken one more second and the fog locked onto our position, all three of us would have had a real problem on our hands. It paused, looked between Kairos and Will, and waved a hand. All right, we're safe now. Ask whatever you want, but keep your voices down. Sound carries out to the fog as well, and I can't dampen that as easily. Will finally came back to himself. He could feel the dim barrier still wrapped around them, and he was full of questions. Was this even the same barrier as before? It looked like the same underlying structure, but the feeling it gave off was completely different. The first one had been brute force defense, a wall taking hits head-on. This one felt more like total concealment, a complete severance from the surrounding space. And pulling on his experience, he could tell the energy signature was strange. It was clearly ghost-type energy, something to do with shadows, but unlike any ghost-type technique he had ever encountered. Years back, during his few ventures to the fringes of the core zone, Will had already tried having his Jengar use its abilities to shroud him and block the soul-devouring fog from detecting him. It had never worked. The fog seemed sharply sensitive to ghost-type energy. The moment you wrapped yourself in it, you lit up like a flare in the dark and instantly became a target. So how had Marshadow pulled this off? It had clearly used ghost-type energy too. Why did the fog seem completely blind to them? He was just drawing breath to ask when Marshadow spoke first, as though it had already known the question was coming. All right, I know what you want to ask. Listen. Marshadow drifted in the air, hands clasped behind its back, carrying the air of someone with very deep, very private knowledge. This is a specialized application of energy, not a conventional defense. Simply put, it's about making yourself disappear into the air rather than planting yourself in front of it. The technique involves a working understanding of space and dimensions. You can't learn it yet. When you reach the point where you can touch that threshold, I'll teach you then. Will stared. How had it known what he was going to ask? He hadn't even opened his mouth. Marshadow looked at his thoroughly baffled expression and rolled its eyes. You had the whole question written all over your face. I'd have to be an idiot not to see it. That look of "how is that even possible and why can't I do it" was practically stamped on your forehead. Will felt heat rise to his face and covered it with a couple of awkward coughs. Since he had been read so easily, he didn't have the nerve to push further. For a technique at that level, even getting a single pointer was already more than he could have asked for. Pressing past that would just be ungrateful. It was at that moment that Kairos spoke up. He hadn't been paying much attention to either of them. He raised one hand and pointed in a specific direction. "So that's where the seal is?" Will turned to look. One glance was enough to burn itself into his memory for the rest of his life. What lay there could no longer be called a sky. It was a sea of deep crimson. The space overhead was entirely swallowed by a strange blood-red light. Not the warm glow of sunlight, but the vivid red of freshly spilled blood, carrying with it something deeply wrong. Beneath that scarlet sky, countless masses of black fog had taken on solid form, wheeling and screaming through the air. They had condensed into all manner of shapes, enormous beasts, twisted distorted faces, nameless writhing tendrils. They churned wildly overhead, and from them rose a deep resonant roar that wasn't particularly loud but bored straight into the mind and raised every hair. At the center of all that black fog was a single enormous dark vortex. It rotated slowly, and the pressure radiating off it made breathing feel impossible. One look was all it took for Will's chest to clench as if an invisible hand had seized it. The terror of that pressure brought despair with it, a suffocating weight pressing down from all sides. The shadow at his feet began to tremble. His Jengar, sheltering inside it, had clearly felt that dreadful force as well. It pulled back into the shadow, its red eyes filled with fear, fixed on the vortex and not daring to move. Even for someone at Will's level, an Elite 4 caliber trainer, the pressure was almost too much to bear. Will stumbled back a step, his expression tight with fear. Cold sweat broke across his forehead and slid down his face. This kind of power. This was completely beyond anything a trainer at their level could stand against. Without the barrier, he thought the pressure alone might have put him on his knees. Will's whole body was trembling faintly, the instinctive terror of a living creature faced with something operating on an entirely different plane. It took him a long while to barely steady himself, and he stood there drawing ragged breaths, feeling like something dredged up from the bottom of a lake. The seal at the heart of the ghost world had already deteriorated this far? Whatever was imprisoned there, even this thin bleed of its aura was already terrifying to this degree. If the seal actually shattered, the entire ghost world and everything beyond it would be consumed. The more Will thought about it, the more certain he was that something had to be done. For the first time, he had a real gut-level understanding of what the ghost world lineage had been holding back all this time. He turned to look at Kairos, wanting to see how the young man was holding up. After all, Kairos had been so calm before. Maybe he had some idea. What he found stopped him cold. Kairos had no reaction to the pressure whatsoever. He looked completely relaxed, and if anything wore a faint expression of mild boredom. He stood there with both hands in his pockets, eyes slightly narrowed. Will's stomach dropped. Could it be that the pressure had hit on such a level that it had knocked Kairos into a kind of shock, leaving him unable to react at all? He was still a young man, after all. He had probably never faced anything like this before. People really did sometimes go completely still when terror reached a certain pitch, losing all capacity to respond. Will was quietly feeling sorry for him, thinking the kid had it rough for his age already having to face something like this, when Kairos suddenly raised one hand. Ha! It was a full, committed yawn. Kairos even stretched both arms up over his head, looking completely unbothered. Will's eye twitched. This was someone who had been scared stiff? This looked more like someone who was just tired. Kairos finished his yawn, dropped his gaze, and looked down at his own shadow, which was still trembling faintly beneath him. Hey, Jengar, you in there? He gave it a light tap with his foot, like someone nudging a friend who had dozed off. A rustling came from the shadow. After a moment, Jengar carefully peeked out with half its face, red eyes still carrying traces of fright, staring fixedly at the vortex and not daring to move much. Clearly the earlier moment had rattled it pretty thoroughly. Kairos looked at how shaken it still was and laughed quietly. All right, stop playing dead. How does this compare to what you saw before? I let you experience that footage, remember? That footage? Jengar blinked, then worked out who Kairos meant. It tilted its head and started thinking back. When they had been working on the game together, Kairos had let it sit through several sequences of footage. When those figures had appeared, the pressure they gave off. Jengar felt something surge through it even now just thinking about it, like its blood had come to a boil, like the entire world was about to be set alight. That had been pure destruction, absolute, overwhelming, leaving no room for resistance whatsoever. Compared to that, Jengar looked once more at the distant vortex bleeding its crimson light and churning black fog. This one was frightening, sure. Eerie in a way that made something deep down want to pull back. But in terms of raw power, it genuinely didn't stack up. When those legendary Pokémon had shown up in that footage, the world-ending momentum, the reality-warping force of them, that was what real terror looked like. This, for all its dramatic presentation, blood-red sky and screaming fog and everything, somehow felt like a lot of noise without the teeth to back it up. Jengar thought it over, then shook its head with firm conviction. Gang! Not even close. If any one of those few had shown up here, the whole mass of fog would have been ash long before now, with no chance to be swirling around putting on a show like this. Kairos saw the head shake and nodded. That's what I figured. He tilted his chin, looking satisfied. So there's really no reason to be that scared, is there? You've seen the real thing. Puts things in perspective. Will stood there beside them, listening to this back and forth between one person and one ghost, and felt his mind go completely blank. His thoughts had stopped entirely. He could not make sense of any of what was unfolding in front of him. These two, this one person and one ghost, was something seriously wrong with them? Faced with pressure like this, faced with a legendary Great Seal, they were having this conversation? And calling it not that scary? Sir, were you being serious right now? The force that had almost made him black out a moment ago was what they were calling not even close? Then what exactly were these figures they were talking about? As that thought surfaced, Will suddenly remembered something. Hadn't Marshadow mentioned that Lord at some point? Could it be that whoever Kairos was referring to was? Chapter 283 An eerie situation in the arrival. Marshadow gave them little time to stand and stare at the vortex. It urged them forward, drifting deeper toward the core. The nearly translucent grey barrier still wrapped around them on all sides, holding the rampaging soul-devouring fog at bay. It looked fragile, like a soap bubble on the verge of popping, yet it worked remarkably well. The instant the barrier drew close, the fog scattered like spooked fish, refusing to come within an inch of it. As they pressed deeper, the environment grew increasingly strange. Near the outer passage, the fog had resembled thick smoke. Now it was closer to something viscous. Almost liquid. The black mist was so dense that it seemed impossible to push through, and even with the barrier's protection, Kairos felt a suffocating weight pressing in from every direction. There was no light here. Apart from the faint grey glow of the barrier itself, the surrounding darkness was total and absolute. What unsettled Kairos most, though, was how unnervingly quiet it had been the entire way. By all logic, even the legendary core of the ghost world should have had some kind of native population. The ghost world had a complete ecological chain. Even in its harshest environments, ghost types would have adapted to survive. And yet they had been walking for quite some time. Aside from the lifeless fog churning around them, not a single spectral shape had appeared. Not a single powerful ghost type. Not even a stray ghastly or dry fluon. Will walked behind the others, his expression darkening with every step. He kept his eyes fixed on the swirling fog, brows pulled tight. The silence was getting to him. He had heard stories about the ghost world's core before. He had never come this deep himself, but every account he had ever read described this place as a zone where life itself was not welcome. Even knowing that, the sheer dead stillness around him was worse than anything those accounts had prepared him for. It was like walking into an old-growth forest that should have been crawling with predators and finding not even a mosquito. That kind of unnatural absence only meant one thing. Something far worse was waiting just ahead. Kairos, by contrast, seemed perfectly at ease. He strolled along with both hands in his pockets, glancing around like he was taking a walk through his own neighborhood. He looked over at Will's grim face. Lord Boundary Keeper, when did this fog first show up? Will blinked, caught off guard by the question. He thought for a moment, then answered quietly. A few years ago. At first it was just a faint trace of black mist at the edges of the core zone. The ghost world lineage didn't think much of it. They figured it was some kind of natural occurrence. But then it started spreading faster. Getting denser. Until it became what you see now. A few years ago, Kairos murmured, rubbing his chin. There's something I don't quite follow. If the Ghost World lineage has always been responsible for guarding the seal here, why wasn't there a forward base set up inside the core zone? You were positioned so far back that by the time the fog had already spread outward, you were only just noticing something was wrong. Will let out a short, humorless laugh. You think we didn't want to be closer? The problem is this place simply isn't somewhere we can operate in. Why not? Will sighed and gestured at the pitch-black void surrounding them. Before this fog appeared, there was none of this extreme black mist, but the core was still the most dangerous spot in the entire ghost world. Because it was home to an enormous number of ghost-type Pokémon with terrifying power. These weren't anything like ordinary wild Pokémon from outside. Their strength was off the charts, and their temperaments were extremely volatile. It wasn't just regular trainers at risk. Even Elite 4 level fighters could lose their lives in here if they weren't careful. Will's expression carried a trace of helplessness. It's not like the Ghost World lineage never tried to build an outpost here. But every person we sent in never came back. Eventually, everyone accepted that this was a forbidden zone no human could set foot in. So for the past several thousand years, the Ghost World lineage has always held its defensive line at the outer perimeter of the core zone. Never pushing any deeper. Kairos genuinely hadn't expected that. If even Elite 4 level fighters wouldn't venture in casually, just how powerful were the ghost types actually living here? In this world, finding a wild Pokémon of Elite 4 caliber was extraordinarily rare. Most wild Pokémon, no matter how well developed, were already considered remarkably strong if they hit gym leader level. Those who could brush the threshold of the Elite 4 were essentially on a legendary tier. How could there possibly be so many of them concentrated in one place? Then a thought clicked. Right. Parallel worlds. If the Ghost World was an independent plane or had its roots in a parallel world, then the rules here would naturally differ from the outside. Marshadow had mentioned worlds where Pokémon tended to be far stronger across the board. If the Ghost World operated under similar conditions, then a high concentration of Elite 4 level ghost types wasn't so hard to believe. That settled most of the surprise. But it immediately raised another problem. If this place had been home to so many powerful ghost types, where had they all gone? Kairos stopped walking and scanned his surroundings carefully. Beyond the impossibly thick black fog, there was nothing. Not even a shadow of those powerful apex creatures. The area was clean, like someone had deliberately cleared it out. Will, where did they all go? Will froze. He instinctively opened his mouth to answer, then stopped cold. A blank, bewildered look spread across his face. Yet, where did they go? He had been so focused on the fog and the stability of the seal that the question had never even crossed his mind. Now that Kairos had pointed it out, the strangeness of it hit him all at once. Those ghost types couldn't have vanished without a reason. This was their territory. Even if something had frightened them, they couldn't have cleared out so completely without leaving a single trace. Will turned to Marshadow, floating ahead of them. Marshadow, do you know what happened? Where did the powerful natives that used to live here go? Marshadow stopped. It turned back, and something complicated passed through its eyes. It let out a quiet sigh and lowered its voice. I'm not entirely sure. I was confined to that passage the whole time and never came out once. I couldn't see what was happening inside, only pick up faint traces of energy fluctuation. But it trailed off, seeming to weigh whether to continue. But what? Say it, Will pressed impatiently. This isn't the time to hold back. Marshadow shot him a look that clearly said, keep it down. Could you please lower your voice? This barrier can block scent, but sound is a different matter entirely. If something picks up on us, we're going to have a serious problem. And if we draw out something truly powerful, I may not be able to protect you. Will promptly went quiet. Only then did Marshadow continue. Even though I didn't see any of them, I can pick up traces of lingering presence in this area. Not long ago, there were still quite a number of ghost types with considerable power moving around here. Those traces are very fresh. They were nearby recently. And they only left a short while ago. Only left a short while ago? Will's heart lurched. Cold dread crawled up through his chest. If these powerful ghost types hadn't returned to their territory and hadn't attacked the front line, where had they gone? This was the deepest part of the ghost world's core, with dangerous forbidden zones on every side. They couldn't have just wandered out for no reason. Unless something had forced them out. Or frightened them off. Will's face went pale. A fresh wave of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. If those creatures had been driven away by the fog, there was really only one place they were likely headed. The front line of defenses established by the ghost world lineage. Under normal circumstances, these ghost types had never engaged with the outside world, staying deep within the core. But if they could no longer remain on their own territory, that was a completely different situation. If they had surged toward the front line like a flood, the consequences would be catastrophic. The defenders currently stationed there had solid combat strength thanks to the League's support, but stopping a full horde of Elite 4 level ghost types simply wasn't possible. Will felt disaster closing in. If this was really happening, the ghost world lineage might be looking at total collapse. No. He had to confirm the situation right now. Will reached into his coat and pulled out a specially designed communicator. The device had been developed by the League specifically for environments like the ghost world. The signal wasn't particularly strong, but it was good enough for transmitting urgent information. His fingers trembling slightly, he pressed in several buttons and connected to the frontline command center's emergency channel. A harsh burst of static came through, the kind of interference unique to the ghost world's magnetic field. Will pressed the device tight against his ear, sweating hard, terrified of missing a single word. Hello? Hello? This is Will. Can you read me? Silence for a few seconds. Then a slightly distorted voice came through. Lord Will? This is the frontline command center. Duty officer speaking. What's going on? Will let out a small breath and pushed forward immediately. What's your situation right now? Have you picked up any abnormal energy fluctuations? Are large numbers of ghost types moving in your direction? The other end paused, clearly caught off guard by his urgency. Abnormal fluctuations? No, nothing like that. Lord Will, everything here is completely normal. Radar isn't showing any large groups approaching. Are you sure you haven't made a mistake? Will stood there, stunned. Everything normal? Nothing approaching? How is that possible? If those powerful ghost types hadn't gone back to their territory and hadn't hit the front line, where were they? Had they simply ceased to exist? Are you absolutely sure? Even the smallest fluctuation counts. This is extremely important. Run through everything once more. The voice on the other end sounded even more puzzled, but answered carefully. Lord Will, we've genuinely checked. Our radar system has been running at full capacity the entire time. We'd pick up even a single moderately powerful wild Pokémon moving in, let alone a large group of ghost types. There are truly no anomalies of any kind right now. Should we go to alert status? We can start preparations immediately. Will stood there, at a loss. The duty officer wasn't lying. That much was clear. So where had those ghost types actually gone? He instinctively turned his head, wanting to ask Kairos, hoping the young man might have some angle he hadn't thought of. But the moment he turned, he froze completely. It wasn't just Will. Marshadow, hovering in the air. Kairos, standing nearby. All three of them locked up at the exact same instant, as if something had hit pause on the world around them. A crushing pressure unlike anything any of them had ever felt dropped over them without the slightest warning. Chapter 284. Bro, is that actually a Giratina? That sensation was like an enormous invisible mountain, falling from the sky above and crashing directly onto their shoulders. Kairos felt his breath seize up, every bone in his body creaking under the unbearable weight in that instant. His body, which had felt relatively at ease just moments before, now felt as though it was bearing a 1,000-pound burden, making even lifting a single finger feel impossibly difficult. This was no ordinary pressure, nor was it that suffocating aura the whirlpool had been emanating earlier. This was a purer, more domineering force. It arrived so suddenly, so directly, without any warning whatsoever and without any cushioning. In that instant, all the black mist throughout the core of the ghost world ceased its movement. The fog that had been churning wildly just moments ago now trembled violently, as though it had encountered its natural predator, and then desperately retreated in every direction, as if trying to flee from the reach of this force. Will's face drained of color in an instant. His knees buckled, and he nearly collapsed to the ground right then and there. He bit down hard and used every ounce of strength in his body to barely keep himself upright. This feeling. This was simply not a force any human being could endure. Even a Pokémon as powerful as his, a champion's Pokémon, could not possibly release this kind of despairing pressure. He had never witnessed anything like it before. Marshadow's expression also turned grim. The grey barrier surrounding its body let out a violent droning sound in that moment, its light flickering erratically, as though it might shatter at any second. Those large eyes of its, which had still carried a trace of composure earlier, now held nothing but profound shock. This force! There was absolutely no way the sealed one could have released this. Although the sealed one was powerful in its own right, its power was cold and sinister, carrying a corroding quality. But this force now bearing down on them was something else entirely. It carried an ancient, weathered, supremely lofty kind of majesty. And most critically of all, there was a terrifying, overwhelming sense of sheer might behind it. Stronger than before, by a wide margin. Kairos struggled to lift his head, trying to see what was happening. But his field of vision was nothing but darkness. The pressure was simply too immense, so great that even his sight had gone blurry. Worst of all, this oppressive force showed no intention of letting them off. It kept intensifying, like an invisible giant hand slowly closing its grip, trying to crush them completely. The sensation of being locked onto was unmistakably clear, as though something in the darkness had opened a pair of eyes and was now coldly watching the three of them, these reckless intruders who had no idea what they were walking into. If this kept up, they would be crushed alive by this pressure before they could even figure out what that whirlpool actually was. Right at that critical moment, Marshadow suddenly let out a low cry. Its body, ordinarily green, erupted with a surge of red flame. The flame did not look particularly fierce, nor did it radiate scorching heat, but it carried an intensely sacred and pure quality. The moment that red flame appeared, like snow meeting a raging fire, the terrifying oppressive weight bearing down on them began dissolving at a visible rate. Kairos felt the burden on his shoulders lighten immediately, the crushing gravity vanishing almost entirely in an instant. As the red flame burned, the grey barrier around Marshadow stabilized once more and expanded outward by a ring, drawing both Kairos and Will back under its protection. The violently churning black mist surrounding them receded rapidly in every direction under the illumination of that red light, like a tide pulling back, and the suffocating sense of oppression that had dominated the air miraculously disappeared. Kairos straightened up and rolled his somewhat stiff neck, a wave of quiet amazement rising inside him. This was the first time he had personally experienced oppressive pressure of this magnitude in the real world. Back when he was developing games, he had often watched scenes featuring various legendary Pokémon in CG cutscenes. The pressure those CGs conveyed was certainly quite realistic, even more intense than the aura-gouging fire had given off before, but compared to what he had just felt, it still seemed to fall well short. It looked like if he ever wanted to upgrade the game module in the future, he would need to find a way to faithfully recreate this kind of sensation. The difficulty would be considerable, but if he could pull it off, the gameplay experience would jump up several levels without question. Meanwhile, the red flame on Marshadow gradually died down, leaving only a faint halo still flowing across its body. It looked back at Kairos and Will, its expression looking rather pained. That last move had not lasted long, but the amount of power it had consumed was no small thing. That was the power Ho-Oh had specifically left with it for self-preservation, and now the better part of it had been spent just to dispel a pressure effect. This was like smashing open a walnut with a gold bar. Absolutely obscene extravagance. It looked at Kairos, its gaze carrying a faint note of grievance. One glance at that expression and Kairos knew exactly what it was thinking. He quickly waved a hand. Relax. Since we used your power, I'm definitely not going to pretend it didn't happen. Once this is all resolved, I'll take care of restoring Ho-Oh's faith energy. Marshadow's expression softened slightly at those words. It gave a small huff and said nothing more. Now that the crisis had been temporarily resolved, there was still work to be done. Kairos turned to look at the black whirlpool still glowing with its bloody light in the distance, a flicker of curiosity passing through his eyes. Well, we still can't see things very clearly from here. We're too far away and can only make out the general shape. Since you look like you're holding up all right, can we move a bit closer? Will froze completely at those words. He stared at Kairos with a look of disbelief, as though he were looking at a lunatic. This person was not from the ghost world. By any reasonable measure, he should be desperate to stay as far away from a place this dangerous as possible. That oppressive force had been absolutely terrifying. Even he himself, someone who had lived in the ghost world his entire life, had barely managed to hold on, and now that they had finally recovered, this person actually wanted to press deeper inside? What kind of mindset was this? Will genuinely could not figure out what was going on inside this young man's head. From the moment they first met until now, his behavior had been completely beyond anything Will's frame of reference could account for. On the surface he looked like an ordinary trainer, yet when faced with a place like this, said to be a forbidden zone in legend, he showed more interest than even the frontier brain himself. And that composed, unfazed manner made it genuinely hard to believe he had originally come here just as a tourist. Will felt a wave of bewilderment wash over him. Still, since Kairos had said as much, and Marshadow did not appear to have any objection either, he had no room to argue. He steeled himself and followed along. Marshadow thought it over and decided that since the last move had already cleared away some of the destabilizing factors in the surrounding area, moving a bit closer should be manageable enough. It glanced at the red light still lingering on its body. This power should hold for a little while longer, and sustaining the barrier to bring them inside for a look should be no problem. Fine, but don't forget what you said. It gave a nod, then turned and drifted toward the direction of the whirlpool. As they pressed further in, the surrounding environment deteriorated rapidly. If what surrounded them before could still be described as dense, impenetrable black mist, then what they were in now was nothing short of pure, absolute darkness. There was no light here at all. Aside from the faint glow emanating from Marshadow's body, the area in every direction was pitch black. Even the thick, viscous fog was no longer perceptible, as though they had entered a void completely devoid of any matter. This darkness gave a person no sense of footing whatsoever, like being abandoned by the entire world. Marshadow, however, seemed to know the way. It led the two of them through the darkness for what felt like an indeterminate stretch of time, the oppressive sensation around them growing heavier and heavier, until at last they arrived at the very center of this darkness. This place was not void. There were things here with real, physical presence. Kairos narrowed his eyes and, by the light from Marshadow's body, finally made out the scene before him. Even though he had long since braced himself, fully expecting this place to be anything but ordinary, when he actually saw what lay before him, he still could not help drawing a sharp breath. It was an enormous array formation beyond all imagination. The formation was carved into the ground, or what could still be called the ground, its lines intricate and densely layered, radiating a dark crimson light that looked as though it had been painted in fresh blood. And at the very center of the formation stood a massive coffin. The coffin was absurdly large, rising before them like a small mountain. It was jet black throughout, forged from some unknown metal, its surface blanketed in strange patterns and symbols. Those symbols flickered from time to time with cold light and appeared to shift and crawl slowly, like living things. Most unsettling of all was that this coffin was covered from end to end in densely packed chains and spikes. Every chain was as thick as a human thigh, covered in rust and dark crimson marks that were impossible to determine were iron corrosion or dried blood. They coiled around the coffin like countless serpents, locked in a death grip. And the spikes were even more imposing, each one as long as a full-grown person, driven deep into the interior of the coffin, as though intended to pin whatever was inside permanently to this space. Simply looking at all of this, Kairos could feel a wave of ominous energy washing over him. The sensation was not only fear, but a deep, instinctive revulsion. What on earth was this thing? Kairos furrowed his brow, his mind working rapidly. He had seen plenty of coffins inside games, but nothing with specifications like this. Never once. This was not a place built to contain a Pokémon. This looked more like a place built to contain a demon lord. And the scale was far too large. What was inside this thing? Could it actually be Giratina? If it really was that one, then this seal looked far too brutal. Whatever it was, it existed at the level of a mythical being. To be treated like this was frankly just disrespectful. Will stood beside him, already completely stupefied. His mouth hung open as he stared blankly at the enormous coffin before him, his mind a total blank. He had heard rumors before about a terrifying existence being sealed within the core of the ghost world, but rumors were ultimately just rumors, and nothing compared to witnessing it with his own eyes. So this was the secret the ghost world had been guarding all along? This was the seal that had made countless people tremble at the very mention of it. Just as the two of them were transfixed by the sight before them, the black mist that had only just settled in the surrounding area suddenly stirred again. The soul-devouring fog began rushing madly toward the coffin as if answering some summons. It did not attack the coffin directly, but flowed like water, seeping through the gaps between the spikes and chains and burrowing into the interior of the coffin. Before long, the coffin, which had been jet black to begin with, was completely enveloped by a thick layer of black mist. Kairos watched this unfold, his brow creasing deeper. Something was off here. Up until this point, he had assumed this soul-devouring fog had been leaking out from whatever was inside the coffin, or perhaps was a side effect of the seal becoming unstable. But looking at the situation now, it seemed as though the fog was actively flowing into the coffin of its own accord. Will had clearly also noticed something was wrong. He stared in bewilderment at the black mist disappearing into the coffin, entirely unable to make sense of it. Wasn't the soul-devouring fog a result of whatever was inside this coffin? Why was it flowing in reverse? And right as the two of them stood there full of questions, the enormous coffin suddenly shuddered. A heavy, muffled sound resonated from within, like an enormous heart beating once. The sound was not loud, but it carried an extraordinarily terrifying penetrative quality, reverberating directly into Kairos and Will's eardrums and making them ring. Marshadow, Will, and Kairos all froze in the same moment. In that instant, the terrifying pressure that had just disappeared came crashing back down onto them. And this time, it was more ferocious and more savage than before, as though something had been provoked. The red light surrounding Marshadow shattered instantly, like glass struck by a sledgehammer, exploding into countless red sparks that scattered through the air. Without Ho-Oh's power as a shield, the oppressive force bore down on them without the slightest restraint. Marshadow's expression changed drastically. It stared in terror at the coffin, letting out a sharp cry. Even with Ho-Oh's protection, they had still been discovered. Whatever was inside that coffin had clearly become aware of their presence. Before any of the three of them could react, the enormous coffin began shaking violently. The chains that had been locked so firmly around it let out a teeth-aching groan. Then, a massive dark shadow burst through the gap of the coffin. The shadow moved with extraordinary speed, like black lightning, tearing through the layers of mist in an instant and appearing directly before them. Kairos stared hard, and his heart lurched. The shape of the shadow was deeply unsettling. It had a body resembling a dragon, but its form was lined with sharp, jagged spines. On either side of its head were structures that resembled wings, and its blood-red eyes were filled with an aura of savagery and slaughter. In that moment, Kairos felt his entire body go rigid. What the? This thing looked exactly like Giratina. So it really was him. Chapter 285 A Certainty of Possibilities. The Reverse World. The dark figure resembling Giratina gave them no time to react. Its form flickered and it lunged. Its speed was terrifying. In the blink of an eye it was on top of them, dragging a gust of foul, metallic wind in its wake. Kairos barely registered the movement before the creature's claws came crashing down. The red barrier around Marshadow shuddered violently, cracking sounds splitting the air with each blow. Not good. Will stumbled back half a step, face drained. He had never seen anything like this. Not once in his entire career as a trainer. Marshadow knew it could not falter. It threw everything into holding its ground, fully aware that if the barrier broke, all three of them were finished. It let out a fierce cry. The green light radiating from its body surged, and the red flame that had nearly been extinguished roared back fiercer than before. Then something emerged from within that flame. A shimmering silhouette, blazing with rainbow light, wings outstretched. The image was unmistakable. Ho-Oh, the rainbow Pokémon. Only a silhouette, yet the divine pressure it carried was absolute. The black mist surrounding them recoiled as if meeting its natural enemy, scattering in every direction. A piercing cry echoed through the entire space. The silhouette of Ho-Oh beat its wings and flung itself at the dark figure. The collision erupted in a blinding flash. A shrill, agonized scream followed and the dark figure dissolved into wisps of black smoke that faded into the air. Will exhaled. But before the relief could settle, the enormous coffin lurched with a violent tremor. The sound that followed was deeper and louder than anything before it, like a massive beast roused from an age-long sleep. A wave of black energy 10 times more powerful poured out of the coffin. It gathered rapidly, congealing into a far larger dark silhouette. More solid than the last. The aura rolling off it was wilder, more savage. The blood-red eyes burning within it held nothing but the desire to destroy. Marshadow's expression shifted in an instant. They could not fight this. What came before had been a probe. This was the killing blow. The power ahead was so overwhelming that Marshadow could not even form the thought of resistance. Run! Without hesitation, Marshadow held nothing back. It poured every ounce of energy into the barrier, seized Kairos and Will, and sprinted back the way they had come. The massive dark silhouette let out a roar and gave chase. It did not attack directly, it opened its jaws and unleashed a torrent of black energy waves. Bang! 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 The barrier flickered wildly under the barrage, threatening to collapse with every hit. Each impact sent violent dizziness crashing through Kairos. Will had it worse held in one of Marshadow's hands, he was thrown about with every lurching stride, his face the color of ash. He had never been this helpless in his life. A champion-level powerhouse, carted along for the ride. If word of this got out, but pride was the last thing on his mind. Survival came first. Dash. The ground around them began to rumble. Kairos forced himself through the dizziness and looked. His heart seized. The solid ground was splitting apart, enormous fissures tearing open one after another across the surface. From those cracks, countless dark shapes came crawling out. Ghost-type Pokémon. Every single one of them. A dense, swarming mass Gengar, Cursola, Sinistcha, Mismagius, all bearing that same eerie red gleam in their eyes, all cloaked in a thin film of shadow. The aura rolling off them was even denser than the silhouette bearing down from behind. Every last one of them, champion level. Kairos understood immediately. The ghost types that had vanished earlier had not vanished at all. They had been hiding underground. Under normal circumstances, even Will would have struggled to escape a coordinated assault from a pack this size. But these creatures were mindless, stripped of reason, reduced to killing machines. The moment they surfaced, they flung themselves at Marshadow, swarming to block the path ahead. Get out of the way! Marshadow bellowed, and the barrier pulsed outward in a sudden explosive expansion, crashing through the mass of ghost types. The weaker ones burst into puffs of white smoke on contact. The stronger ones were sent tumbling, unable to hold it back. Will had recovered enough to act. Battered as he was, his hands had not been idle. He released his Gengar from its pokeball. With Gengar providing cover, the pressure on Marshadow eased just enough. They broke through the encirclement and kept running. The massive dark silhouette was still in pursuit, but strangely, it halted the moment it reached a certain point. The frenzied ghost types did the same, every one of them freezing in place as if they had struck an invisible wall, not a single one crossing that line. Marshadow carried them for a good distance more before finally slowing to a stop. It set Kairos and Will down, then doubled over with deep, heaving breaths. The green light surrounding its body had dimmed considerably. Will simply dropped to the ground and lay there, drinking in the air. After a long moment he managed to lift his head and stare back at the region still swallowed by black mist. So, they can't come out, it seems. The silhouette had been right behind them, yet it stopped as though it had struck something solid. Whatever was in that mist, something was keeping it contained. Whether that was good news, Will had no idea. Kairos remained standing. He stared into the dark, his mind working quickly. The mist, the coffin, the ghost types, it was all connected. The mist had flowed back into the coffin, and whatever was sealed inside had gone berserk. That meant the mist could control or influence it. Which left two questions. 1. Was what was sealed in the coffin actually Giratina? 2. Which came first, had the mist created this situation, or had the coffin produced the mist, which then took control of the ghost types? Both answers would determine everything they did next. And for one of them, he thought he might already know. He turned toward Marshadow, intending to ask. It knew this place better than either of them. He never got the chance to speak. Dash. The ground beneath his feet split apart without warning. A tremendous suction force erupted from the crack, and then an enormous jet-black claw came surging up from below. It was massive, bristling with rows of jagged backward curving spines that caught the dim light like blades. It punched straight through Marshadow's freshly restored barrier as though it were not there at all. Then it closed around Kairos. Fast. Neither Marshadow nor Will processed what had happened in time. By the moment their minds caught up, Kairos was already locked tight in the grip of that claw. Kairos. Will lunged forward. Marshadow was faster. It fired a burst of black energy directly at the claw, while Will's Gengar launched shadow balls from the other side, both of them attacking without pause. The claw did not move. Not even a twitch. No matter how fiercely they attacked, they could not leave a scratch on it. Then the claw wrenched downward. An irresistible force tore through Kairos. His balance vanished. He did not manage a shout. His vision went black, and he was hauled down into the earth. The ground sealed shut above him with a heavy sound, as though nothing had happened at all. Kairos was gone. Dash. Marshadow stood frozen, staring at the spot where he had disappeared. This was the person it had promised to protect. The person it had sworn to help restore Ho-Oh's faith in the world. And he had been snatched away right in front of its eyes. What had that claw been? Why had the barrier done nothing against it? Marshadow had attacked with everything it had and made no difference at all. Will stood beside it with his mouth open, equally dumbfounded. This place. First the coffin. Then the silhouette. Now something dragging people underground. What was hiding in the ghost world? He and Marshadow exchanged a glance. Neither of them had a single word. From Kairos' perspective, all he had felt was that colossal, unyielding force and then nothing. His vision went dark. His body was thrown into chaos, spinning and lurching through absolute blackness, weightless and directionless. He could not tell how long it lasted. It might have been an instant. It might have been much longer. Then the turbulence faded. Kairos opened his eyes. This was not the depths of the earth. This was not some dark cavern. The sky above him was warped, soaked in a deep reddish purple. The clouds did not drift as vapor, they hung in the air as jagged, broken shards, clinking and grinding against one another in the silence. There was no ground beneath him. Instead, an endless expanse of floating geometric forms drifted through the void. Square monoliths. Triangular spires. Spiraling columns. Each one slowly rotating, each one suspended in empty space. Each one upside down. Kairos stood very still, taking in the impossible geometry around him, the wrongness of every surface and angle, the sky that felt like a floor and the void that felt like neither. Words surfaced in his mind. Slow, certain, and cold. The reverse world. Chapter 286, Face to Face with Giratina, another slate fragment. To be fair, if you dropped a physicist here, they would probably feel their entire worldview collapse on the spot. Everything in this place was inverted, and not just the massive geometric structures floating in the air. Even the light itself was reversed. What should have been sunlight streaming down from above was instead shooting up from the abyss below their feet, blazing straight toward the deep crimson sky. And if that were not strange enough, Kairos could clearly feel the presence of wind, except this wind blew in the wrong direction too. It did not brush against his face. Instead, it felt like countless invisible hands grabbing at his clothes and hair, trying to drag him upward into the sky. The intense sensation of weightlessness and disorientation forced him to dedicate the better part of his concentration just to keeping his balance. But what truly made his skin crawl was not any of these violations of the natural order. It was the strange shadows he noticed in the surrounding area. Near those enormous inverted stone pillars and spires, vague humanoid figures were shifting about. No, not just humans. Pokémon too. They were walking along the surfaces of those structures. Walking, literally walking, even though those structures were suspended upside down in the air. They moved with complete steadiness, as though gravity simply did not apply to them. Kairos narrowed his eyes and tried to make out what those things actually were. The longer he stared, the clearer the shadows became. They had the outlines of humans and Pokémon, but they had no faces. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth expanse of grey-white, radiating an indescribable quality of eeriness and deathly stillness. And these faceless shadows were not motionless. They were busy going about their business in this upside-down world, some carrying things, some looking around. He could not make out any expressions, yet Kairos felt a suffocating sense of oppression rolling off them in waves. There was no doubt about it. This was the reverse world. He was still working hard to adjust to this inverted reality, his mind spinning rapidly in search of a plan, when an overwhelmingly powerful sensation of being watched struck him without warning. The feeling was unmistakable, like something terrifying had locked its gaze onto him. He snapped his head up and looked toward the sky. Something was there, lurking within that twisted violet-crimson cloud layer. Soon enough, he could make it out clearly. It was an enormous spectral silhouette. And it looked almost identical to the dark shape that had crawled out of that coffin a short while ago. The same dragon-like body. The same enormous wing structure. But Kairos quickly noticed the differences. The silhouette before him had its eyes closed. And the aura it emanated was nothing like that of the creature from the coffin, which had been saturated with savagery and bloodlust. This one felt far more ancient, far more profound, carrying a majesty that made him want to bow his head without quite knowing why. The feeling was as if he stood before a true sovereign, a deity who ruled over this entire dimension. Kairos's expression shifted into something peculiar. Because he had just figured out something very important. If the thing in that coffin had truly been Giratina, his legendary Pokédex would have reacted long ago. Yet when he had stood before that coffin earlier, his system panel had not made a single sound. So whatever that had been, it was not Giratina. But now, things were different. The moment he looked up at this silhouette, that familiar system notification chime finally rang out in his mind. Encountered the god of the reverse world, Giratina. The golden text pulsed across his vision, almost painfully bright. This closed-eyed silhouette before him was the true Giratina. The aura it gave off matched perfectly with what he had sensed from those ancient murals. While his thoughts were still racing, the silhouette in the sky moved. Slowly, it opened its eyes. Crimson pupils, deep and fathomless as a bottomless abyss. That red gaze drifted down and settled on Kairos with an almost lazy ease. In that single instant, Kairos felt as though he had been laid completely bare. Every secret, every thought, seemed to have nowhere to hide beneath that gaze. Then a deep, resonant voice rang out directly in the depths of his mind, carrying a terrifying weight of authority. Human. The voice came again, reverberating through the entire space. I am the Lord of Inversion. State your name. Kairos took a slow, deep breath and worked to steady himself. Fortunately, the other party did not seem hostile. Because if Giratina had wanted to act, Kairos would already be dust. And the fact that it had bothered to ask his name meant there was room for conversation. The pressure radiating from this entity was at least 10 times more crushing than what that thing in the coffin had given off, but as long as communication was possible, that was a good sign. Even so, he would need to tread carefully. Kairos exhaled and did his best to keep his voice steady. Hello. My name is Kairos. He answered with his mouth while his mind kept working without pause. Now that he had actually encountered the real Giratina, he needed to learn as much about it as he could, and fast. Know yourself and know your enemy. It would not guarantee victory, but it could only help in a situation like this. With a mental nudge, he quickly opened his legendary Pokédex. Countless golden pages flashed through his mind at high speed, the entries of various legendary Pokémon flickering past one after another. His target was clear, the entry for Giratina. The golden page stopped. It displayed Giratina's basic information. But most of the critical details were obscured behind a veil of mist, completely illegible. Paid content. A system prompt box immediately popped up. Viewing detailed records requires 5,000 emotion points. Use. Kairos winced inwardly. 5,000 points? Was this system trying to rob him? This was pure highway robbery. He was pretty sure checking gouging fire had only cost around 2,000. Now it wanted 5. Then again, thinking it through, Giratina's tier was incomparably higher than gouging fire's, so it probably made sense that it cost more. No use agonizing over it. Spend it. The moment 5,000 emotion points were deducted, the obscuring mist finally dispersed, and detailed information about Giratina appeared before him in dense text. Kairos scanned it rapidly, terrified of missing anything critical. Name, Giratina. Identity, Sovereign of the Reverse World, God of Boundaries Broken. Likes, Darkness, the respect of humans and Pokémon, interesting new things. Dislikes, Confinement, rude humans, combat. Current affection level, none. Kairos froze. This personality, was really like this? His mental image of Giratina had always been something cold and utterly remote from human concerns, or else an explosive-tempered entity prone to threatening to destroy the world. He had never expected that this one's preferences would be so grounded. It liked being respected. It liked interesting new things. What surprised him most was that it apparently disliked combat. Still, knowing the other party's preferences made things much easier to work with. Kairos cleared his throat quietly and adjusted his composure. He arranged his expression into one of polite respect and spoke with genuine courtesy. If I may ask, esteemed Lord Giratina, what is it that has led you to summon me here? And what is this magnificent and extraordinary space? Where exactly am I? A deliberate question, given that he already had a strong suspicion. The effect was immediate. The suffocating pressure that had been radiating from Giratina's silhouette genuinely eased by a degree. Kairos felt the tension in his chest loosen slightly. So the information from the legendary Pokédex really was accurate. This creature did respond well to this kind of approach. As long as he remained respectful, it would not act recklessly. The red gaze continued to watch him, but the stinging intensity had faded considerably. Giratina's voice rang out in his mind once more. It was I who pulled you here. I require your assistance with a matter. Kairos felt a small jolt of surprise. It had brought him here because it needed help from him? What could he possibly do for the Lord of the Reverse World? Though his mind was full of questions, he let none of it show on his face. Keeping his relaxed and natural demeanor, he spoke casually. May I ask why you chose me? There was a trainer named Will nearby. His strength far surpasses mine, and he has several powerful Pokémon at his side. Wouldn't he be a better fit if you need assistance? The question was posed diplomatically and politely. Kairos was genuinely curious. Will was at the pinnacle of champion tier ability, carrying multiple formidable Pokémon. By any objective measure, his strength was far greater. Giratina did not answer right away. It simply raised one of its claws slightly. Before Kairos could figure out what it was doing, he felt a ripple in the space around him. Then a beam of iridescent light came flying out of his pocket. The feather. Ho-Oh's feather. The feather he had been carrying with him all this time was now glowing with a soft, gentle radiance, hovering motionlessly in the air between them. When Giratina looked at that feather, something different entered its voice. To have earned the recognition of that one, you are no ordinary being. Kairos understood immediately. So it was because of this feather. It seemed Giratina recognized Ho-Oh, and judging by the tone, the relationship between the two was not unfriendly. That implied Giratina probably had existing ties to other legendary Pokémon, maybe even knowledge of them. That was good news. Before he could ask anything further about Ho-Oh, however, Giratina's voice turned serious once more. To speak plainly, I need you to go and eliminate that worthless thing that dares to act in my name. I cannot leave this place. Therefore, I require you to act. Kairos went still for a moment, then immediately understood. An impostor. That had to mean the dark shape that had crawled out of the coffin. But, eliminate it? The whole issue had come full circle back to the same fundamental problem. He had already seen the strength of that silhouette firsthand. Even the spectral projection of Ho-Oh that Marshadow had summoned had only barely deflected its first assault, and afterward had been completely unable to resist it, forced to take them and flee. He had not even had a chance to say anything before Giratina's voice rang out again. If you help me deal with that filth, I give you my word, within this reverse world, there will be a place for you. You will be granted the right to reside here, under my protection. It sounded tempting enough on the surface. Receiving the protection of a legendary Pokémon, and a place to live in a realm as extraordinary as the reverse world. Yet, no thank you. Kairos instinctively glanced to the side. He looked at the faceless shadows walking along those inverted structures. Blurry, featureless, radiating deathly stillness and uncanny silence. If he lived here, these things would be his neighbors every single day. How horrifying would that be? And on top of that, this place operated on inverted physical laws. If he stayed long enough, his brain would probably ooze out through his ears. Not to mention, if he came to the reverse world, would he eventually end up like these shadows? This was one offer he could gladly do without. Kairos felt his scalp prickling with discomfort. This was not a blessing he was equipped to receive. He was racking his brain trying to figure out how to phrase a refusal that would be neither offensive nor blunt when Giratina seemed to read his thoughts. A flicker of something almost amused passed through those red eyes. It did not appear surprised by Kairos's reluctance at all. Oh? You would rather not? Kairos was about to explain himself when Giratina raised a claw and cut him off. Perhaps, then, I can offer you something else instead. As its words faded, its other claw swept through the air in a slow, unhurried gesture. A mass of pitch-black substance, dark as ink, materialized from nothing and drifted slowly toward Kairos until it hovered right in front of him. The thing was not large, only about the size of a palm, and its shape was irregular, like a fragment of something shattered. But the presence it radiated was extraordinary. It was a pure, concentrated aura of darkness, and yet that darkness did not feel malevolent. If anything, it gave off a sense of profound quiet, something ancient and mysterious. Before Kairos could even get a proper look, the system prompt in front of his eyes began flashing wildly. This time the prompt box was solid gold, the same as a particular occasion he remembered from before, and it stood out brilliantly. Legendary tier item detected. Arceus slate fragment, ghost. The inside of Kairos's head rang like a struck bell. Another Arceus slate fragment? And unlike the one he had obtained in the second world, this one's typing actually aligned with his current two Pokémon. Ghost type. It was still a fragment, but compared to the previous one, this piece was visibly more intact, the aura and energy it gave off were considerably stronger, and its overall condition was clearly superior. Repairing this one would probably be significantly easier. Now this was what he was talking about. This was a real prize. Something like this was infinitely more appealing than residency rights in the reverse world. Giratina watched his reaction, and its voice came again. This was something I claimed in a battle long ago. It contains the primal power of the ghost type. Accept the condition I have laid out, and this is yours. It will be of considerable benefit to your companions. Faced with these terms, Kairos did not hesitate for even a moment. Dealing with the ghost world was already what he had been planning to do in the first place. Giratina's request and his own objective were perfectly aligned. But still, the problem remained exactly the same as before. How on earth was he supposed to take down that thing? Chapter 287 The Truth and a Piece of Good News. At that moment, Kairos stared at the hovering fragment of the Arceus tablet before him. He wanted it badly, but he didn't reach out for it right away. He understood perfectly well that nothing good ever came for free. The thing was genuinely valuable, no question about it, but taking it meant accepting the responsibility that came with it. He had seen the imposter's power with his own eyes. Even the phantom of Ho-Oh that Marshadow summoned could barely hold it off, and in the end, escaping was the only thing that saved him and Will. His own strength right now was nowhere near comparable to that monster's. If he accepted the mission without having the ability to back it up, he wouldn't just fail to complete it. He'd probably lose his life in the process. And looking at the current situation, Giratina was sending him because it couldn't go itself. Otherwise, judging by its attitude, it would have already torn that thing apart with its own claws. He took a deep breath, doing his best to make his expression appear sincere, and addressed the enormous phantom looming in the sky above. Giratina, I have no intention of refusing your request. This tablet fragment is genuinely important to me. However, you witnessed the imposter's power just now. Even the phantom of Ho-Oh that Marshadow summoned couldn't stand against it. With only my current strength, I'm afraid I would have great difficulty completing what you've entrusted to me. So, is there any way you could give me the power needed to fight it? The question was direct and practical. When dealing with a legendary Pokémon of this caliber, dancing around the point would only backfire. Better to lay his difficulties out plainly. Giratina responded with a low, cold snort. The sound reverberated through the hollow expanse of the distortion world, sending the floating rebel nearby into a faint tremor. It was clearly filled with intense contempt toward the imposter, and that emotion came through unmistakably even in its voice. That despicable fraud! There was a thread of disdain running through Giratina's voice. It is no god, and it is unworthy of my name. It is nothing more than a lowly spiritum. A spiritum? Kairos blinked. He hadn't expected that the terrifying creature that had nearly wiped out their entire group was actually just a spiritum. Spiritum was a peculiar ghost-type Pokémon in its own right, but compared to something like Giratina, a deity bound to creation itself, the gap in both standing and power was simply too vast. Giratina continued its explanation. This spiritum stumbled upon a fragment of the distortion world many years ago. That fragment contained a trace of my power. By stealing the energy within that fragment, it was able to disguise itself in my image and acquire the strength it now possesses. Hearing that, Kairos instinctively raised his eyes and looked around. He'd been too busy earlier adjusting to the weightlessness and observing those faceless shadows to examine the surroundings carefully. Now that he looked properly, he could see something was wrong. The architecture here was grand, possessing a strange and otherworldly beauty, but many parts of it were fractured and floating adrift. The sky in the distance was incomplete as well, certain areas appearing as though they had been torn away by force. Looking carefully at the sky, the entire world resembled a glass sphere that had been shattered halfway and clumsily pieced back together. He committed that to memory. Was that connected to why Giratina couldn't leave? Sure enough, what Giratina said next confirmed his suspicion. The distortion world as it stands is incomplete. It is precisely this incompleteness that prevents me, as its sovereign, from leaving freely. Should I depart, this world would collapse entirely, and I would suffer grievous injury. That is why I must act through you. Kairos nodded. The logic held together now. Giratina was a guardian imprisoned here, unable to leave, which was why it needed a proxy. But he still had one question. If that spiritum had only stolen a trace of Giratina's power, how had it managed to cause such massive disruption in the real world? It hadn't even flinched at Ho-Oh's phantom. Giratina seemed to read his confusion and continued. Although it stole that power, it had originally been sealed away by a powerful binding long ago. The means by which it broke free of that seal was through that black mist. At the mention of the mist, Kairos felt a tightening in his chest. Giratina's voice went on. That mist absorbs the soul energy of Pokémon and other living creatures, a corrosive force that slowly devours the seal binding it. As long as it absorbs enough soul energy, the seal will shatter completely and it will gain true freedom. Giratina paused, and a note of cold hardness entered its tone. However, it currently has one critical limitation. The mist's power is not yet strong enough to latch onto anything but untethered souls, and it cannot stray too far beyond the seal's boundary. Once it moves outside that range, the area around the coffin, its power drops sharply. At that, a rapid succession of images from earlier in the ghost world flashed through Kairos's mind, and all the scattered threads snapped together at once. He remembered watching the mist move as though it were alive, surging from deep within the forest and then flowing back into the coffin. That wasn't simple diffusion, it was more like a harvest. He also recalled the moment the mist came to a sudden stop at a certain boundary. He had wondered at the time why it didn't keep spreading. Now he had his answer, it couldn't travel too far from the seal. That also explained the Pokémon that had been affected by the mist, explained why they had become so overwhelmingly aggressive. It wasn't simple infection or frenzy at all. The spiritum was controlling them directly. Those Pokémon under its control were being driven to attack other Pokémon and humans, all for the underlying purpose of harvesting soul energy. The spiritum was using those pawns to accumulate the energy it needed to break its seal. Everything clicked into place for Kairos. Once that was clear, the path forward became much less daunting. His eyes lit up as he looked toward Giratina. If it's sustaining its form and breaking the seal by absorbing soul energy, then we actually don't need to fight it head-on. If we find a way to purify that mist, or cut off its connection to the mist and stop it from drawing on soul energy, wouldn't it weaken on its own, or get resealed? It reminded him of a dungeon boss mechanic. The boss was unkillable because weaker enemies kept feeding it power. Clear out the smaller enemies, cut off the supply, and the boss became nothing but a big punching bag. A glimmer of approval passed through Giratina's crimson eyes. It was clearly satisfied with how quickly Kairos had grasped the situation. You are perceptive, human. That is precisely where its weakness lies. Then its tone shifted, becoming heavier. Simple in principle, but far from simple in practice. That mist has already blanketed the core region of the ghost world, and its corrosive effect is extreme. An ordinary Pokémon that enters would be consumed and lose its mind in an instant. And you are too weak. Giratina's words were blunt and landed hard. Kairos understood that Giratina wasn't referring only to him. It meant the guardians of the ghost world's lineage as well, and even Elite 4 level trainers like Will. In an environment like that, where ghost-type Pokémon of Champion and Elite 4 caliber roamed freely and the mist seeped in from every direction, an ordinary trainer walking in would simply be throwing their life away. Purification would be impossible, to say nothing of confronting the spiritum itself. It genuinely looked like a dead end, too weak to fight it, and no way to cut off its supply. And yet, when Kairos heard those three words, too weak, he didn't feel discouraged. He froze. His mind instantly echoed back to the mission description the system had issued earlier. Help yourself, your ghost world lineage, grow stronger. Resolve the crisis of the ghost world. He had always found that mission strange. Facing something of that caliber, even if the ghost world's people received a power boost through some reward, they still wouldn't be able to beat the fake Giratina. Now everything lined up perfectly. The system's mission had never been asking him to solo the boss. It hadn't been asking the ghost world's people to go head-to-head with the spiritum directly. Since a direct confrontation wasn't required, and what was actually needed was clearing away the ghost-type Pokémon acting as its pawns and purifying the mist that served as its fuel supply, the whole thing looked completely different. Going back to the game analogy, clear the weaker enemies, purify the mist, strip the spiritum of its energy source, and it would naturally weaken or even get resealed. No champion-level power needed, just enough people and proper coordination, and it was entirely doable. This was workable. But how was he supposed to get the trainers of the ghost world's lineage, along with the League's people, to willingly go out and clear those dangerous ghost-type Pokémon? That meant risking their lives. A regular game wouldn't cut it for this. His previous game had done well, but its essence had nothing in common with life-or-death combat of this kind. He needed to make a new game from scratch, one that could simulate this kind of environment, teaching people how to fight the mist, how to coordinate and purify it together. But what kind of game would actually fit? Kairos began thinking through it seriously. While he was running the numbers in his head, working out a rough design for a new game, Giratina fell silent. It seemed to be considering how best to support this human ally, because at this point, he was its only hope. Then, abruptly, an intensely deep black radiance began to emanate from Giratina's body. The light shot skyward and punched straight through the distortion world's crimson-purple sky, vanishing into the void beyond. The entire distortion world shuddered violently with that single action, as though something had been forcibly altered. Kairos looked up in surprise, watching the direction where the column of light had disappeared. What was that? Giratina answered calmly. I have temporarily suppressed the creature inside the coffin. I cannot destroy it outright, but under the weight of my power, it cannot spare the attention to control the mist beyond its confines. When you and the ghost world's people venture into its depths, at least you will not face a direct assault from its true form. Without the boss interfering directly, they only needed to focus on the controlled Pokémon and the mist. The difficulty had been cut in half. Then a second, comparatively gentler black radiance rose from Giratina's claw, drifting downward and settling over Kairos before sinking into his body. A cool, foreign sensation flooded through him, and the discomfort the weightlessness had caused him instantly faded, his body finding its balance again. Giratina spoke. This is a thread of my divine power. When you face mortal danger within the ghost world, it will preserve your life once. It is only effective within the ghost world. Do not squander it carelessly. Kairos felt the cold, formidable energy within him and rubbed his nose. This sensation was oddly familiar. Ho-Oh's feather had worked the same way as a lifeline back then. It seemed legendary Pokémon all had a fondness for handing out these kinds of emergency tokens, though technically Ho-Oh's had not exactly been given freely. With this, he felt considerably more confident. At the very least, while exploring the core region of the ghost world, he wouldn't have to worry about losing his life. Giratina beat its enormous wings, and the surrounding space began warping again, that powerful weightlessness surging back over him. Go, human! Do not disappoint me! The world spun violently, and before Kairos could say another word, an irresistible force dragged him out of the distortion world. Dash! The ghost world! The spot that had been relatively calm before was now littered with signs of destruction. Marshadow and Will were in the middle of a frantic struggle against the ghost-type Pokémon flooding in from every direction. Kairos's sudden disappearance had taken a real toll on their morale. They were still managing to hold the line, but their mood was grim. The Pokémon kept coming in greater and greater numbers, seemingly without end. Marshadow was weaving through bursts of will-o-wisp, looking increasingly haggard. Its moves hit hard, but the ghost-type Pokémon showed no fear of death. One wave went down and the next crashed right into its place. Will's Gengar was roaring and driving back wave after wave of Chandelure. Sweat beaded at Will's brow as he directed Gengar's attacks while scanning in every direction, searching for any sign of Kairos. Where the hell did that kid go? Will let out a frustrated curse. He wouldn't admit it out loud, but he was genuinely worried about Kairos. Kairos was just an ordinary trainer, and without Marshadow, he was even worse off than Will himself. That claw from earlier had been something that even Will couldn't have resisted. Making things worse, the Pokémon surrounding them kept multiplying, closing in tighter and tighter. Just as both of them realized they couldn't keep waiting for Kairos and needed to find a way out, he appeared in the air beside them as if out of nowhere. The sudden appearance startled both Marshadow and Will. Marshadow nearly launched a shadow ball at him and only pulled back at the very last instant. Will blinked hard, half convinced he was seeing a ghost-type illusion. Once they made out that it was Kairos, back in one piece, both of them rushed over. Still deflecting any attacks that might come from the surrounding area, they fired questions at him urgently. What just happened? Where did you go? Will didn't finish his sentence, but the meaning was plain. They had both assumed Kairos was dead. Marshadow was staring at him with an expression caught somewhere between relief and reproach, its will-o-wisp flickering a shade dimmer. You actually came back alive. Kairos looked at the anxious expressions on both their faces and shrugged. Yeah, still alive for now. As for what happened, I seem to have gone somewhere very strange and paid a visit to someone very, well, very powerful. And I came back with good news. I have a way to deal with that thing. Chapter 288 A way to fix this, something only you can do. When Kairos said that, both Will and Marshadow felt the tension inside them finally ease. Ever since Kairos had been snatched away, they had been stretched to their limits. But now he was standing in front of them, completely unharmed, calmly saying there was a way to fix this. The crushing weight on their chests lifted halfway. Will wiped the cold sweat from his brow, disbelief plain in his voice. You're serious? There's really a solution. He was a champion, the ruler of the ghost world. And yet even he had felt powerless in the face of that horrifying presence he couldn't even fully understand. Kairos claiming he had an answer made Will want to believe him, but he couldn't shake the fear that it might be wishful thinking. Kairos didn't reply immediately. Instead, he looked around and assessed the situation. Although Giratina had suppressed the imposter, the ghost-type Pokémon controlled by the fog hadn't disappeared. Without a central will directing them, they had only grown more chaotic, rampaging blindly through the mist. Kairos turned back to them, expression steady. The thing sealed away isn't a god. It's actually a spiritum. Will and Marshadow froze. A spiritum? That monster that had nearly wiped them out, that had even stood against Ho-Oh's phantom projection, was a spiritum? Seeing their stunned faces, Kairos continued. A long time ago, it obtained a shard from the reverse world. That shard carried a trace of Giratina's power. That's how it managed to pass itself off as something divine. It was sealed once before. To break the seal, it's been using the black fog to absorb soul energy. He pointed toward the distant region still swallowed in darkness. That fog is both the key to breaking the seal and the source of its strength. It's been driving those infected ghost Pokémon to attack living beings for one reason, to harvest souls and erode the seal. If we defeat the ghost Pokémon carrying the fog and purify it, we can drastically slow down the seal's collapse. We might even force it back into dormancy. The information hit all at once. Will and Marshadow stood there, stunned. Kairos had only been gone a short time, dragged away by that massive claw, yet he had returned with the enemy's identity, motives, and weakness laid out clearly. It was as if he'd been handed the entire blueprint. Will opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't even know where to begin. Kairos saw the confusion in his eyes. There was no way to explain the system, and even less chance of casually mentioning that he'd just met Giratina. Will probably didn't even know who that was. Before he could redirect the conversation, Marshadow suddenly stiffened. Its large eyes locked onto Kairos's chest. Even the ghostly flames around its body paused. Wait. Where's your feather? Kairos blinked and looked down. The Ho-Oh feather was gone. Now that Marshadow mentioned it, he realized it hadn't been returned. Giratina hadn't said a word about it before sending him back. Kairos thought it over and decided it wasn't worth worrying about. The feather's one-time protection had already activated. Until it recharged, it was basically just a keepsake. And Giratina, a being on that level, wasn't going to hoard a single feather. It would give it back. Probably. And even if it didn't, he now carried divine protection from Giratina itself. It wasn't as though he'd come back empty-handed. He shrugged. Must have dropped it somewhere. Or maybe someone picked it up. Marshadow immediately puffed up in outrage. The flames around it flared brighter. How can you say that so casually? That was a feather from the great Ho-Oh. It's an incredibly precious treasure, capable of restoring life. How could you be so careless? To Marshadow, that feather wasn't just an item. It was sacred. Kairos watched it wave its little arms and couldn't help laughing. All right. That's on me. I shouldn't have brushed it off like that. I'll figure out a way to get it back, okay? Happy. He said it mostly to keep Ho-Oh's most devoted follower from lecturing him all day. Marshadow finally calmed down, though it still looked uneasy. It drifted closer and spoke directly into Kairos's mind. Who took it? You're not sloppy. You wouldn't just lose something like that. Was it the one who grabbed you? Kairos sighed internally. Sharp as ever. Since there was no point dodging, he replied through telepathy. You guessed right. Someone took it. But I doubt they meant to keep it. They probably just forgot. You know who Giratina is, right? The moment the name landed, Marshadow's expression changed completely. Its body stiffened. Wariness, and something close to disgust, flashed in its eyes. It was Giratina. There was disbelief in its voice, and concern. Kairos nodded. So you do know it. What's the issue? Is it that infamous? Marshadow spun once in the air, clearly unsettled. Infamous? That one has a terrible reputation. Violent temper. Unpredictable. It's never gotten along with the great Ho-Oh. If Giratina summoned you, there was nothing you could have done. But daring to take Ho-Oh as feather? That's unacceptable. When I reconnect with Ho-Oh, I'm reporting this. Then it added quickly. And stay away from it from now on. It's powerful, yes, equal to the Great One. But it doesn't follow any rules. You don't want to get dragged into whatever it's involved in. Kairos filed that away. So Ho-Oh and Giratina really were on bad terms. And Giratina's reputation in the Pokémon world wasn't exactly glowing either. It made sense. A being that ruled the reverse world and embodied distortion would naturally be feared. I'll be careful, Kairos said. I'm not looking to get tangled up with it. This time wasn't my choice. Marshadow nodded but kept glancing around warily, as if expecting Giratina to reappear at any second. Meanwhile, Will stood off to the side, watching the silent exchange between boy and Pokémon. Neither had spoken aloud for a while. He raised a hand cautiously. Mind telling me what's going on? For heaven's sake! He was a champion, one of the strongest trainers in the world, master of the ghost world. Yet today he had been outmatched, shut out, and left confused again and again. It was humiliating. Marshadow turned and rolled its eyes dramatically. With your current strength? You don't need to know. Even if we told you, there's nothing you could do. You'd just stress yourself out. Will nearly choked. The indignity. But the worst part was, he couldn't argue. He really hadn't been able to hold his ground earlier. He wisely chose not to push it further. One more exchange and that little ghost would talk him into the ground. Drawing a steady breath, he turned back to Kairos. He could no longer see him as just a talented young trainer. Kairos knew Marshadow. He knew the Great One it kept referring to. He had been seized by that monstrous claw and returned completely unharmed. If Will hadn't personally seen the Jengar Kairos raised, he might have suspected Kairos himself was some rare Pokémon in human form. He cleared his throat. Your secrets are yours. I won't pry. You said there's a solution, and I believe you. So what exactly do we do? He gave a wry smile. We've fought the ghost tide and that fog for years. We tried pushing deep into its core, aiming straight for the source. His expression darkened. There were too many infected Pokémon. The area was too vast. And they didn't fear death. Our offensives accomplished almost nothing, and the casualties were devastating. Eventually we had no choice but to retreat and focus on defense, minimizing losses as best we could. Hard lessons, paid for in blood. Kairos nodded. I understand. In the past, there wasn't much you could do. But that's about to change. He paused, organizing his thoughts. He couldn't exactly say, I'm going to roll out a system interface and turn this into a leveling mechanic. So he chose a safer explanation. I can't explain the details. But a certain great being has indicated that something will appear soon. When it does, it will allow all of you to grow stronger. Will's head started spinning again. Something will appear? Grow stronger? Was some powerful entity stepping in to grant strength to the ghost world out of pity? That kind of thing belonged in myths. Yet Kairos looked utterly certain. Will thought for a long moment. Then his eyes hardened with resolve. Whatever it is, if it can resolve this crisis, that's enough. What do you need from me? His voice was steady. As master of this domain, he had long accepted that giving his life to preserve the seal was part of his responsibility. If he needed to serve as bait, or take on some dangerous role, so be it. So long as the ghost world survived. Marshadow's expression grew complicated. It respected Will. He was responsible, honorable. But the situation was far more tangled than he realized. Ho-Oh was missing. Giratina was trapped in the reverse world. None of it added up. Before it could untangle its thoughts, Kairos spoke. There is something you can do. In fact, only you can do it, Will. Will straightened. Soon, something will appear before everyone's eyes. It will teach you how to fight the fog and how to coordinate your efforts. Your job is simple. Be the first to trust it. Be the first to use it. Show everyone that it's real. If you take the lead, the others will follow. Will blinked. He hadn't understood a single word. Something will appear? What exactly is going to show up? Chapter 289 Kairos's plan and goal, the perfect option. The space around them lurched. Whatever had been holding the barrier together finally gave out with a sound like splitting timber. Crack! A massive fracture tore open in midair, and through it poured an even denser flood of ghost-type Pokémon, eyes burning red, mouths twisted in shrieks, surging forward like water through a broken dam. They looked ready to shred anything in their path. The group snapped back to the moment. There was no time for talking. The defenses had hit their limit. Stay any longer and they'd be completely swallowed up. Kairos's eyes went sharp. He turned straight to Marshadow. Marshadow, stop wasting time. Get us out of here. Fall back somewhere safe. Marshadow didn't need to be told twice. The ghostly flames wreathing its body surged up, and its entire form dissolved into a streak of light. Hold on tight. It shot forward, carrying Kairos and Will, and blazed straight back the way they had come. The ghost-type Pokémon moved to cut them off, but Marshadow was running at a level they couldn't match, weaving through the storm of incoming attacks with sharp, decisive turns, forcing a path through by sheer speed alone. Will sent his Gengar to cover the rear, clearing the pursuers with Shadow Ball and Sludge Bomb. They ran flat out, and just before the barrier collapsed entirely, burst free of the danger zone. Before long, they were back in the passage they'd come through. Kairos looked back at the area now completely swallowed by mist. Marshadow exhaled beside him, visibly relieved. It dragged a hand across its brow in a very theatrical show of wiping sweat that wasn't there, wearing the expression of someone who had just barely made it out alive. That was way too close. Almost left our bones back there. Will was still breathing hard, the frantic sprint having burned through more of his energy than he would have liked. Kairos, by comparison, looked relatively composed. He leaned against the passage wall, though his eyes weren't relaxed at all. His mind had already moved on to the next problem. A few minutes ago, he had neatly deflected the question of who created the games by pinning that credit on Giratina, which was a reasonable enough answer. A legendary Pokémon appearing out of nowhere to grant power through mysterious means raised far fewer questions than anything else would. He had managed, at least for now, to keep his identity as the game's creator safely buried. If people figured out he was behind all of it on his own, there was no telling what kind of mess that would kick off. Having a legendary Pokémon to take the credit? That was about as good as it got. With that handled, the picture was clear. The enemy's weakness was identified. The legendary's help was secured. All that was left was going back and building the next game. But this time, Kairos wasn't thinking about a closed-off adventure RPG like before. The ghost world was vast. Ghost-type Pokémon were scattered everywhere, slippery and impossible to pin down. A straightforward combat simulation wasn't going to reach every corner of it. What he needed was something that could tie the entire ghost world together. A format that let any trainer participate at any time, from anywhere. His mind moved fast, running through game mechanics like flipping through cards. Then his eyes landed on the phone in his hand, and something clicked. He had it. If the threat was ghost-type Pokémon scattered all over the place, why not make the real world the game's map? The moment that thought formed, one game surfaced immediately, Pokémon Go. He'd never fully experienced it back in the day due to regional restrictions, but he knew the mechanics cold. Players used their phone cameras to detect and catch Pokémon in augmented reality, overlaying the game world onto the real one and completely reinventing how Pokémon was played. It had swept the entire globe when it launched. He could rework that concept directly. Instead of catching virtual Pokémon in the real world, the game would guide trainers through the ghost world to hunt down ghost-type Pokémon that had been corrupted by the mist. The phone screen would become a lens connecting reality to the ghost world. The moment a trainer opened the app, they'd have a full map of the ghost world in front of them, with the locations of dangerous ghost-type Pokémon updated in real time. On top of that, Kairos planned to build in a data analysis feature. The screen would show a live radar with nearby ghost-type Pokémon positions, and tapping any target would pull up its full profile, level, base stats, and a breakdown of its weaknesses. There was one more piece, though, and it mattered. According to Will, the people currently fighting mist-corrupted ghost Pokémon throughout the ghost world weren't just members of the ghost world faction. Bounty Guild operatives and League-dispatched trainers were out there too. Ghost world members might fight with real conviction, driven by a sense of duty. But the other two groups were obviously here for profit. When things got genuinely dangerous and the reward wasn't worth it, they'd run, exactly like the team Kairos had been part of at the very beginning. A game could fix that. Defeating ghost Pokémon wouldn't just mean clearing threats. It would pay out real, usable rewards, items and bonuses that could be applied directly to improve a Pokémon's potential, or traded in for rare gear. Whether it was money or any number of different items, none of that was a problem on his end. With that in place, what would otherwise be a terrifying ghost invasion would look, to the players, like a massive server-wide hunting event. Picturing it, Kairos couldn't quite hold back a smile. This was actually a pretty good idea, wasn't it? Through this game, every trainer would become an active hunter. They'd chase ghost-type Pokémon relentlessly for the rewards, which would sharpen their skills, which would push them toward stronger targets, and without ever really noticing, they'd be dismantling the Ghost World crisis piece by piece while being too absorbed in the hunt to think about it. That was a real total war. The more he turned it over, the more solid it looked. He even had a name ready, Ghost World Hunter, Go. The one problem standing between him and a finished product was this: distributing rewards was easy enough, and generating the Ghost World map wasn't an issue either, but how exactly was he supposed to get real-time activity data on every Ghost-type Pokémon across the entire Ghost World? The map generation module hadn't provided anything close to that level of detail. Stats, base values, individual creature data were all absent. There was only a vague location marker. Kairos shook his head slightly. Polishing this into something that actually worked was going to take some time. The good news was he had a reasonable amount of it, whether Giratina was buying him room by slowing down that purifier, or simply because 2 weeks were still on the clock. Either way, it was enough. Let's go. We head back. The news will come soon enough. Will and Marshadow exchanged a glance. They still didn't quite understand what news Kairos meant, but seeing that calm, unhurried confidence on his face did more to settle their nerves than any explanation would have. As long as it solved the problem, it didn't matter what kind of show was coming. If it came to it, they'd play along. All right. Let's go. Will nodded and stepped through the passage first. Marshadow drifted up to Kairos's shoulder and muttered, just low enough for him to hear, "You'd better actually have a plan. Otherwise I'm going straight to someone to complain." Kairos just smiled, said nothing, and reached up to give its head a light pat. The moment they stepped out of the passage, the noise hit like a wave, washing away every trace of the silence and oppressive weight that had filled the tunnel. The area had clearly become a makeshift staging ground at the Ghost World's outer perimeter. Voices filled the air, technique light flashed and crisscrossed overhead, and the shockwaves from nearby battles sent faint tremors through the ground underfoot. Marshadow reacted immediately. A flicker of violet light wrapped around its small body, and it slipped straight down into Kairos's shadow. It wasn't lacking in courage. It just had zero interest in drawing attention in front of this many people. As a legendary Pokémon, being recognized would cause a scene that would probably outdo the ghost-type Pokémon themselves. Inside the shadow, Gengar silently shuffled sideways to make room for its distinguished guest. This one's built different. Not touching that with a 10-foot pole. Kairos let his eyes adjust to the light, then swept his gaze across the chaotic battlefield ahead. He stopped. There, on a stretch of rubble near the edge of the fighting, 3 familiar figures were barely holding on. Rex. Lena. Barton. The bounty hunter team he had fallen in with when he first entered the Ghost World. The situation was not good. A countless swarm of ghost Pokémon was pressing in from every direction. Rex had none of the commanding authority he'd carried back in the safe zone. Soaked in sweat, he was barking orders at his Machoke, which swung its fists furiously, knocking back incoming ghost Pokémon with fire punch. Damn it! Why are there more of them every second? There's no end to this. There was a thread of desperation in his voice. Lena's side wasn't holding up much better. Her Arbok had laid toxic spikes and spikes across the ground, but ghost-type Pokémon floated. Ground hazards were worthless against them. Arbok was reduced to spraying poison continuously, trying to intercept attacks raining down from above. Barton, their defensive anchor, had his Bastiodon standing like a small mountain, defense stats that were genuinely exceptional, but even it was starting to buckle under the relentless pressure. Barton himself was silent as stone, mechanically wiping dust from his face and grunting with each impact. All 3 of them were running on fumes. At this rate, 10 more minutes and the ghost swarm would have them. Then a dark purple figure shot past Kairos. Will. He had been holding himself back long enough. Getting chased through that tunnel had left a pressure building in him that needed somewhere to go. Gengar, go. Will's voice dropped to a low, flat command. The Jengar trailing at his side expanded in an instant, its already unnerving grin twisting into something far more fearsome. It let out a sharp, piercing wail, the kind of sound that seemed to cut right through the soul, and every rampaging ghost Pokémon in the vicinity froze for just a moment. Then Jengar pressed its palms together. A massive shadow ball began to form between them, seething with destructive energy. It was enormous, crackling with black lightning at its core, and just hovering in place was enough to make the surrounding air groan under the pressure. "Goodbye." Will said it quietly. Jengar flicked its hand. Boom! The massive shadow ball crashed into the ghost swarm like a meteor. There was no dramatic explosion. Just a single, dense, crushing impact. And then every ghost Pokémon the shadow ball's energy had touched simply ceased to exist. No screams, no final moments. Just wisps of smoke dissolving into nothing. A vast, empty clearing had been punched through what had been a solid wall of ghost Pokémon. The ones that remained seemed to hit something that triggered a deep, instinctive terror. They shrieked and scattered, and within seconds, every last one of them had vanished. The entire battlefield went quiet. Rex, Lena, and Barton were still standing in their fighting stances, completely blank. They stared at the emptied ground in front of them, then at Will, standing not far away without so much as a wrinkle out of place, and their mouths fell open. That was it. The ghost swarm that had nearly killed them, wiped out in a single move? The gap between them was almost impossible to take in. By now, the trainers nearby, those who had been watching from a distance or grinding through their own fights, had caught up with what just happened. No way. That's Will's Jengar. Holy, it's actually the Ghost World Master himself. The one they say is the strongest ghost-type user alive. That shadow ball, completely worthy of a World Master. I can't believe I'm seeing this in person. Coming to the Ghost World was worth it. The crowd erupted. Cheers and gasps layered over each other, and countless awestruck eyes locked onto Will. Will stood there taking it all in, and quietly let out a long, slow breath. This was where he belonged. The time in that tunnel with Kairos had been something else entirely. That constant low hum of dread, the awareness that he could be wiped out without warning, had been wearing him down moment by moment. Every second in there had been its own particular kind of misery. This, by comparison, being looked up to, being the strongest presence in the room, having everyone's reverence aimed at him, felt like coming home. He almost wanted to cry. This was the world he was made for. While Will was savoring that long-missed feeling, a Ghost World faction member in a distinctive uniform came jogging over with barely contained urgency. The man bowed deeply the moment he arrived, respect written plainly across his face. "Master Will. You've finally returned. The other two World Masters have been looking for you. They say there's an urgent situation that needs your input right away. Please come immediately." He said it loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Several people around them felt a jolt of unease. If the other two World Masters were calling a meeting, something serious must have happened. What followed left everyone completely dumbfounded. Faced with the appeal, Will gave it one brief, disinterested glance, showing no sign of being in any hurry to respond. His gaze moved past the messenger and came to rest on Kairos, standing at the edge of the crowd with his usual calm expression. The commanding presence from a moment ago vanished. What replaced it could only be described as warmth. "So, Kairos." Will walked over quickly. "I should head back, right? Since those two are waiting, but the second you have any news, you have to tell me first. Can we swap contact info? A Pokédex number, a COMM device, anything works." For a moment, it felt like the whole scene had been paused. The crowd that had just been cheering went completely silent. Every eye in the area went wide. They hadn't misheard, had they? The World Master, the champion, the legendary Will, was practically asking an ordinary-looking young man to exchange contact information? And the way he was acting, if anything, it looked like that person was the World Master. What was going on? Every gaze in the area snapped to Kairos. They wanted to understand exactly who this person was, to have earned that kind of treatment from Will. When they actually got a clear look at him, the confusion only deepened. He looked completely ordinary. Admittedly good-looking, but nothing about him radiated power, nothing even hinted at a high-level trainer. He didn't have a single Pokémon visible on him. He was just standing there. What exactly made him special? Some kind of hidden family lineage? Unusual backing? Rex, Lena, and Barton, who had only just recovered from the shock of the battle, stared at the scene and went blank all over again. Rex rubbed his eyes, genuinely unsure whether he'd taken a hit to the head during the fighting. Is that Kairos? He stumbled over the words. Lena looked like she'd seen a ghost too. Even the arbok at her feet had stopped flicking its tongue, staring blankly into the middle distance. It really is him. Barton didn't speak, but the hand polishing his glasses was trembling faintly. Whatever was going on inside him, it was far from calm. They had already known Kairos was capable. The strength he'd shown while they were together had been genuinely remarkable, and that unshakable composure of his had left a lasting impression. Even so, he had been a talented young trainer with exceptional ability. That was the version of him they knew. How, in the short time since they'd separated, had he become someone a world master regarded with what looked like cautious deference, even a desire to stay in his good graces? The jump was too absurd to process. What on earth had happened? While everyone's imagination ran wild trying to fill in the blanks, Kairos spoke. Actually, you don't need to exchange contact info. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried cleanly to every ear in the area. When there's news, you'll receive it directly. Go ahead. Surprisingly, Will didn't take offense. If anything, he looked relieved. He nodded several times. Got it. I'll head over now. Take care of yourself. He held Kairos's gaze for one more moment, then his silhouette dissolved into shadow and disappeared, moving quickly away. Even after Will had gone, the crowd hadn't fully come back to themselves. People looked at each other. A heavy silence sat over the area. Finally, the Ghost World faction member who had delivered the message worked up the nerve to step forward. He was nervous, but as someone from the Ghost World faction, he needed to make sense of this. Anyone Will treated with that kind of regard was clearly not an ordinary person. Excuse me, sir. The man swallowed and asked carefully. Would you mind if I asked what your connection to Master Will is? Just now, that was. He didn't finish. Kairos cut him off. Kairos looked at him briefly. Nothing particularly special. He needed a favor, and I'm in a position to help. That's all. The man felt a deeper shock settle over him at that. The kind of favor that would make Will personally reach out was anything but simple. He didn't dare press further. He simply nodded several times. I see, I see. In that case, sir, what are your plans from here? Is there anything we can help with? Kairos shook his head. No need. Just have someone walk me out of the ghost world. That's all I need. Thank you. You're leaving already? The man paused, clearly not expecting Kairos to be heading straight out into the more dangerous areas beyond the staging ground. But seeing the resolve in Kairos's expression, he didn't feel it was his place to argue. He straightened up and nodded at once. Of course. Right away. I'll take you to the transit point. He turned and led the way. Kairos followed, but after 2 steps he stopped and looked back at Rex's group, still frozen in place nearby. All 3 of them were staring over at him, not quite clear of the shock. Kairos's gaze passed across each of them in turn, as if something had just come back to mind. If you want to get the most out of what's coming, trust me, stay put. Don't leave. Something is going to happen in about 2 hours. When it does, you'll understand. He didn't linger after that. He turned, caught up with the Ghost World member leading the way, and disappeared into the crowd. That left Rex, Lena, and Barton standing right where they were, looking at each other. A gust of wind stirred the dust from the ground and drifted through their somewhat disheveled hair. Was he just talking to us? Rex rubbed the back of his head, uncertainty written all over his face. Lena drew in a slow breath, and something sharpened behind her eyes. Obviously. Who else is around? She bit her lip, clearly weighing it. So do we follow his advice, or do we go? Barton finally spoke, his voice low and rough. The 3 of them were quiet for a few seconds. The original plan had been to leave the moment their job was done. The danger level here had already pushed all 3 of them to their limit, and the smart move was to pull out. But no lengthy discussion was needed. A single look between them was enough to tell each of them what the others had already decided. In the short time they'd spent with him, the power and quiet mystery Kairos carried had planted something that felt a lot like trust in each of them. And any person that Will treated the way he'd just treated Kairos, the words that person spoke were not going to be empty. We stay. Rex's eyes hardened with resolve. We're already out here fighting ghosts for our lives anyway. If there's something worth gaining, it's worth the gamble. We're in. Lino let out a short, quiet laugh. Her Arbok let out a low hiss beside her. Fine. Then we stay. I want to see exactly what happens in 2 hours. Barton silently pushed his glasses up and nodded once. The three of them turned together and moved toward the edge of the staging ground, found a spot with a clear view and enough cover, and settled in to wait. Unconditional trust in that guy. It was the thought all three of them shared, without needing to say it out loud. Chapter 290 Game Development begins, Module Upgrade. Kairos followed the Ghost World member toward the faction's border. The scenery along the way was even bleaker than what he'd seen in the passage earlier. Despite being closer to the outer perimeter, the suffocating sense of pressure hadn't let up at all. The fog was thicker than before, visibility dropping to barely a dozen meters in any direction. Dark shapes kept cutting through the mist, trailing piercing shrieks as they hurled themselves at the trainers holding the defensive line. The fighting here was clearly getting worse. The ghost-type Pokémon just kept coming. They didn't seem to care about losses, throwing themselves in wave after suicidal wave against the defenders. The trainers on the line, for their part, had mostly been pushed to their absolute limits. Every face looked hollowed out with exhaustion. Even during brief breaks, nobody let their guard down. They kept their Pokeballs clutched tight at all times, like they expected a ghost to claw up through the ground at any second. That kind of relentless mental grind was worse than any physical beating. As he walked, Kairos took in his surroundings without making it obvious and struck up what passed for casual conversation with his guide. Hey, I never actually asked about the Ghost World faction in detail. Besides Will, how many other faction masters do you have? And roughly what level are they? The member stumbled slightly, clearly not expecting the question. But he glanced back at Kairos's easy expression and answered straight. As for that, our Ghost World faction has 3 faction masters total. You've already met Lord Will, and he's unquestionably the strongest. The other 2. He paused for a moment, as though sorting his thoughts. One is Lady Anla, the only female faction master. She runs cold, and her strength sits at the mid-tier champion level. Her main partner is a Mimikyu, and her methods are pretty brutal. The other is Lord Carries. Built like a wall, always wearing sunglasses. Also mid-tier champion level, and he commands an incredibly powerful dark ray. Solid on both offense and defense, though he's still a step behind Lord Will. Kairos gave a small nod. 2 mid-tier champions and 1 high-tier champion. That was actually a serious lineup. In any region, a single champion-level trainer was considered the absolute ceiling of power. The Ghost World faction had produced 3 of them at once. And yet, even with that, they were still being ground down by this ghost uprising. That said a lot. Raw individual power from the top wasn't enough to plug the gap anymore. Whether it was the sheer volume of ghost Pokémon or the concentrated strength at the heart of the disturbance, elite fighters alone couldn't turn the tide. The only real option was to mobilize every available trainer and make up that enormous shortfall in numbers. With that thought still turning over in his head, he tossed out another casual question. One more thing. Is the Ghost World faction short on people? The guide's step faltered noticeably. The man turned around with a blank look, like he couldn't understand why anyone would bother asking something so obviously self-evident right now. Still, he gave an honest answer. Short? Desperately. He let out a long sigh, voice heavy with resignation. Honestly, this is a mess of our own making. For a long time, our faction was way too exclusionary. Plenty of elite trainers tried to join and got turned away at the door, so our numbers never grew. Now that we're actually in a crisis, we just don't have the bodies. We've been trying to recruit recently, but the results have been pretty bad. The people willing to come in aren't up to the standard, and they can't handle the kind of environment the Ghost World demands. At the root of it, the Ghost World has been getting more chaotic, resources are drying up, and the benefits we can offer have taken a real hit. He caught himself there, seeming to realize he'd said more than he probably should have. Some of this was internal. But then again, the person walking next to him was someone even Lord Will treated with clear respect. He wasn't exactly an outsider. A little more openness wasn't going to hurt. Kairos listened and nodded slowly. Exclusivity, resource drain, shrinking benefits, declining recruit quality. A textbook death spiral. If nothing broke the cycle, the Ghost World faction would eventually just be worn down and swallowed by the endless tide of ghost Pokémon. Thanks. Kairos stopped walking and said it simply. Before the guide could react, Kairos swept his hand through the air in a light motion. A talisman glowing with a soft violet light materialized out of nothing and was held out toward him. Small thank you, for showing me the way. The man took it by reflex. Then he looked at it and completely froze. The energy pulsing through the talisman was so pure, so dense, that the pressure rolling off it was enough to make a person's very soul shake. Nothing in the range of ordinary resources could come close to this. This was the kind of top-tier item that could only be found in the most dangerous depths of the ghost world, the kind that would sell for a fortune on the open market with buyers lining up and no sellers to be found. His hands trembled faintly as he held it, overwhelmed by the terrifying ghost-type energy contained within, too lit up with excitement to string together a proper sentence. This is way too much. I can't take this. His words said one thing. The hands locked around the talisman with no intention of letting go said something else entirely. Kairos waved it off, signaling there was no need for ceremony, and kept walking. The guide had no choice but to bow several times over, offering repeated thanks, before carefully tucking the talisman into the innermost pocket of his jacket. The grin on his face refused to go away. The two of them talked as they walked, and before long they reached the border of the ghost world. A massive portal stood there, radiating a calm white light. It was the only passage back to the real world, the same one Kairos had entered through. Just as they were about to approach, two fully armed guards stepped out and blocked their path. Halt! One of them barked sharply, eyes narrowing with clear suspicion. We're in a wartime state. Entry and exit are strictly prohibited without authorization. Passes out, and state your reason for leaving. The Ghost World member's expression hardened. Without a word, he reached into his jacket and produced a specially issued identification card, holding it up in front of the two guards. Will's personal emblem was stamped prominently across it. The two guards, who'd been bristling with authority a moment before, went completely still the instant they saw it. The color drained from their faces almost immediately. They lowered their heads and stepped aside without another word. The guide put the card away and turned to Kairos with an explanatory tone. Sorry about that. Things in the ghost world have gotten bad enough that a lot of people are trying to desert and run, and fewer are coming in to help. Orders from the top are to scrutinize anyone trying to leave. That's why they reacted that way. Hope you understand. Kairos gave a calm nod. He did. In times like these, tight enforcement was a necessity. Without that checkpoint, there'd probably be nobody left willing to stay and fight. He walked to the edge of the portal and felt the familiar energy signature pulsing from within, then stopped. He turned his head slightly and glanced at his shoulder. It was empty now, but Marshadow had been perched there the whole time. Do you want to come out with me? Kairos asked inwardly. The shadow stirred. Marshadow glanced at the white glowing portal, then looked back at the fog-shrouded ghost world behind them. It hesitated for a moment before finally shaking its head. Nah, I'll pass. Marshadow scratched its head and muttered. I'll keep an eye on things here. Feels safer. Besides, that guy's out here handling everything alone. He's probably running on empty. I'll stick around and help. That guy it was referring to was, of course, Will. For all the sniping remarks it had been throwing his way just moments ago, when it actually mattered, it was clear Marshadow genuinely cared about him. Kairos heard it out and didn't try to talk it out of staying. Given the situation, staying here was genuinely more useful than heading out. And with Marshadow nearby, if something went seriously wrong on Will's end, he'd hear about it right away. All right. Take care of yourself. Kairos gave a brief nod, then stepped forward into the light of the portal. His silhouette blurred and gradually dissolved until it was gone entirely, swallowed by the border of the ghost world. The moment he stepped through, a heavy wave of dizziness hit him, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift. But having gone through it once already, it didn't rattle him much this time. He steadied himself, and within moments he'd adjusted to the disorientation that came with spatial transit. A few minutes later, Kairos stepped out of the transport hall and looked up to find the world had changed. The sky, which should have been bright, was darker and heavier than when he'd first entered the ghost world. Thick, oppressive storm clouds pressed down over the entire city, carrying a weight that made the air feel almost difficult to breathe. Then again, that made sense. If things on the Ghost World side had already deteriorated that far, it would be strange if the real world showed no reaction at all. There was clearly some kind of connection between the two. A ghost uprising on that scale was almost guaranteed to produce ripple effects like this. And if the legendary Giratina actually managed to break through its seal, a darkening sky would be the least of anyone's problems. If that creature escaped from the Ghost World. Kairos shook his head and clicked his tongue softly. This Pokémon world was a lot less safe than he'd originally figured. Not that sitting around thinking about it would help anything. The immediate priority was to stay focused and deal with the problem in front of him, to handle the looming catastrophe before the seal gave out entirely. Kairos scanned his surroundings and made no move toward home. Time was the critical factor. He did a quick circuit of the streets of Goldenrod City and spotted a private internet cafe that looked reasonably low-key. He paid for a private room at the front desk and headed straight inside. Once the machine booted up, the system loaded onto the terminal as well. He got to work immediately, rapidly building out the game's framework inside the system. With the system's help, the process moved fast. The basic framework came together in short order, and a fresh game prototype appeared on the screen. But that was only the start. The real work was everything that still had to fill it: model textures, plot scripts, all the painstaking detail work that would take serious time even with the system lending a hand. Not that he planned to carry all of it himself. That's exactly what the crew at Dream Factory was there for. Those developers had already proven through their actual work that they knew what they were doing. There were enough of them that as long as he provided the core framework, handing the content work over to them would get everything done as fast as possible. But there was still one critical problem blocking his path. To pull off what he had in mind for this game, the framework alone wasn't going to cut it. He needed two specific modules to accurately replicate the Ghost World's conditions inside the game. The first was Special Advanced Module, Region Form, Conceptual Expansion Pack. One of its functions read: Terrain Scan and Replication. You may use this module to scan all areas of your current world, learn all terrain types and special zones belonging to this world, and automatically generate game content replicating them into the game, or view them as a map. But that alone still wasn't enough. The module could scan terrain, but it seemed to give only a simple red dot marker for infected ghost Pokémon. That was nowhere near enough information. Players needed to know the specific location, strength level, and movement patterns of each ghost Pokémon. A single red dot wasn't going to cut it. He pulled up his personal panel and checked his current emotion point balance. Even though he'd been running non-stop these past few days, his point accumulation hadn't slowed down at all. The massive player base on the second world side was generating a steady stream of emotion points every day, and combined with what he'd already stockpiled, the total was substantial. 75,000 points. That was a serious number by any measure. With that many points, buying several mid-tier modules wouldn't even make a dent, and even the moderately priced high-tier modules were well within reach. Since resources weren't the issue, the path forward was obvious. Kairos was just about to search the shop for a relevant auxiliary module when the system's notification chime went off. Detected that the host currently possesses the Region Form, Conceptual Expansion Pack. Upgrade conditions have been met. Would you like to expend 20,000 points to upgrade it to Advanced Special Module Plus? An upgrade? 20,000 points was a bit steep, but it was within an acceptable range. Go ahead. A clear chime rang out, and 20,000 points vanished in an instant. A moment later, a notification confirming the successful upgrade popped up. The display in front of him shifted dramatically. The Ghost World map, which had still looked somewhat hazy before, underwent a sweeping transformation. The map sharpened significantly. Terrain outlines that had previously only shown in rough form were now rendered in full 3 dimensions with precise detail. Zoomed in, you could even make out the twisted trees and jagged ravines scattered throughout the Ghost World. But that wasn't the biggest change. The biggest change was this: across the newly detailed terrain, countless colored dots were now spread in dense clusters. Red dots marked ghost Pokémon. Green dots marked human trainers. Every single dot was pinned clearly on the map. Kairos tapped one of the red dots, and a line of detailed data appeared immediately. Gengar, mid-tier gym leader level, located in Outer Ghost World Zone B3. Current status: Berserk, advancing toward the defensive line. Ability: Shadow Tag. During battle, the opponent finds it extremely difficult to flee. Specific effectiveness scales with the difference in strength. Held item: none. Known moves: Shadow Ball, will-o-wisp, foul play. He looked it over, then tapped a green dot. Alliance Trainer, N. Located in Outer Ghost World Zone A2. Strength level, High Tier Elite 4. Current status, Pokémon critically injured. Personal stamina severely depleted. Kairos's eyebrows shot up. Now that was exactly what he needed. Chapter 291 Perfect Preparations. Where would you even find a boss like this? The map was extraordinary, essentially a cheat code that revealed everything. But for Kairos, it still wasn't enough. Knowing where wild Pokémon and people were was one thing. He needed a way to match that information to the right players, a precise, intelligent system that could connect raw data to the people who could actually do something with it. It was like having a massive database with no search function. The data meant nothing without the logic to make sense of it. He needed to feed the Ghost World's conditions into the game in real time, so players would know exactly what they were walking into before they took a step. No more accepting a mission and then getting wiped out 2 seconds later by a champion-tier ghost Pokémon lurking behind the door. And beyond that, this system could completely replace the Ghost World's official mission board. If the bounty hunters who spent every waking hour scraping for work could access intelligence this precise, covering every corner of the Ghost World, they'd probably lose their minds. In a place like the Ghost World, information kept you alive. And staying alive meant getting paid. But even that wasn't enough. Kairos's fingers drummed lightly against the desk, his brow creasing. He could post missions in the game, players could accept them and head into the Ghost World to hunt targets. That part was straightforward. The problem was figuring out whether a given player was actually up to the job. What if someone who was only hitting gym leader strength accepted a mission to take down a high-ranking Pokémon? That was just sending them to die. This was a war, yes. But Kairos had no interest in pointless body counts. What he needed was a module that could check players' real-world status in real time. Not just their Pokémon rosters, but a real read on their actual combat strength. Only then could he properly match players to missions at their level, with rewards to match. With that thought, he pulled up the system interface. System, is there a module that can check players' real-world situations in real time and analyze their combat power? Something that could even predict win rates. The system was quiet for a moment. Then pale blue text floated up across the screen. Detecting host's requirements. Searching for relevant modules. Search complete. Recommended purchase, Intermediate Module Reality Scanner. Function Overview. This module bypasses spatial limitations to monitor bound players' real-world conditions in real time, including Pokémon status, physical condition, mental state, and more. A built-in algorithm automatically rates each player's combat power and simulates battles between the player and a specified target, whether in-game or real-world, to calculate win probability. If needed, the module can also send tactical guidance to players through the game. Kairos stared at the screen. Hey! Something like this was only an intermediate module? He had figured that anything involving real-world monitoring and intelligent analysis would be at least high tier. But thinking it through, it made sense. The module's core functions were querying and support. It couldn't directly interfere with reality or boost anyone's stats. Under normal circumstances it would be completely useless to him. He had no time to sit around combing through other people's data. Right now, though, it was exactly what he needed. How many points? Intermediate module, reality scanner, price, 5,000 points. 5,000 points. Practically pocket change. Buy it. 5,000 points were deducted in an instant. A new icon appeared on his system panel, sitting alongside the upgraded map module he had picked up earlier. He tapped it, and a large virtual window opened immediately. He picked a player at random to test it, someone who had been pretty active in the Second World recently, and entered the ID. That player's full profile spread across the screen like a medical chart. Player ID, Raging Charizard. Real-world location, Upper District Simulated Battle Park. Current status, mentally stimulated, mild fatigue. Main Pokémon, Charizard, hasty nature, blaze ability, held item, charcoal. Overall combat power assessment, gym leader, early stage. Simulated battle target, Ghost World Outer Zone B3, Gengar, gym leader, mid stage. Win rate prediction, 12%. Recommendation, avoid direct confrontation. Engage from the air using flying type advantage. Win rate can be raised to 21%. Kairos looked over the rows of data and analysis filling the screen and gave a satisfied nod. Now that was what he was talking about. With this, he could turn the entire Ghost World battlefield into one massive game dungeon. Players wouldn't be stumbling around in the dark. They would be soldiers, moving with real intelligence backing them up. He took a slow breath. The end was in sight. The framework was in place. The map was ready. The monitoring system was up and running. One final piece remained. Rewards. Without good rewards, nobody was going to risk their lives in a hellhole like the Ghost World. Even routine in-game missions got ignored when the payout wasn't worth it. He checked his remaining point balance. The last purchase had cost 5,000, leaving him with just over 50,000. He had originally planned to hold onto those points for a higher tier module upgrade down the line. But right now he had no choice. He needed to pull some rewards first. A lot of them. Enough to make players' eyes go wide the moment they opened the mission list. He had no idea what the draws might turn up. His confidence in his own luck had never exactly been sky high. But still, what if? Before drawing rewards, though, he needed to loop in the Dream Factory crew. The game's framework was built, but the character models, textures, story dialogue, and mission scripts all still needed to be filled in. That was exactly their lane. Once that was sorted, there was one more call to make. Somewhere in Withered Leaf City's upscale residential district, a luxurious villa blazed with light. This was where the former Dream Factory employees had set up shop. After the mass walkout, the group had relocated here and turned the villa into both a workspace and a crash pad. The first floor lobby was buzzing with noise and energy. Dozens of high-performance computers ran at full tilt, their screens casting pale light across faces that had no interest in sleep. Every expression in the room carried the same look, focused, a little wired, and completely in their element. Keyboards clattered in rolling waves. There's a timeline problem here. If the protagonist runs into the Skycloud Expedition's captain at this point, the rest of the story falls apart. Push that event back 2 chapters. Let him deal with the Devil's Forest incident first. We can use it to introduce the teammate's special ability along the way. Fine. But isn't the maze a bit punishing? The failure rate in the test zone is already sitting at 30%. Is it? I think that's exactly right. These are rescue teams. There's supposed to be a challenge. I already bumped up the drop rate on the final floor's treasure chest. Anyone who clears it will walk away happy. At the long table in the center of the lobby, several core members sat huddled over design diagrams, gesturing and arguing with everything they had. That kind of back and forth happened every single day. Back at Dream Factory, management would have called it a waste of time. Here, nobody was looking over their shoulders. As long as the game turned out great, they could practically tear the walls down. During a break, a programmer with thick glasses dropped onto a nearby couch with a sigh, cradling a cup of coffee. "Hey, Mark, how many headhunting calls did you get this week?" Mark, the lead designer, smiled faintly and held up a hand. 5. 5. The programmer pushed his frames up with a smug look. "I got 8. One was from the HR director at Stellar Entertainment. Triple salary and a 2% equity stake." He paused. I hung up immediately. "And here I thought we quit for the money." Mark shook his head with a short laugh. "Hilarious." The programmer took a long sip of coffee. "Exactly. And even with the overtime every day for the past 2 weeks, I feel more satisfied than I ever did at Dream Factory. Back then, making games meant making them for the paycheck, for whoever was signing the checks. Now." He trailed off and leaned back with a comfortable exhale. "And it's not like the money is bad either, right?" The programmer grinned and said nothing. Of course it wasn't. The game was completely free to play, no purchases of any kind. But advertisers had been calling non-stop, practically melting the phone lines. Someone had offered over $1 million Poké just for the right to run a single energy block ad inside the rescue team base. They had carefully brought it up with their mysterious contact, Wind. His reply had been immediate. He didn't need the money. Do whatever they wanted with the ad revenue, just don't plaster garbage all over the game. Good grief. Where did you even find a boss like that? Mark shook his head with a quiet laugh. I did the math. What we made in just these 2 weeks is already more than 10 times what we used to pull in a month. Every time I go to deposit it, I'm half expecting the teller to flag my account. The two looked at each other and cracked up. Every person in that room was quietly, deeply grateful for the decision they had made. If they hadn't walked out together, they would still be sitting in that airless office right now, grinding away on some soulless rehash of a game that already existed. Then, without warning, the lobby went silent. It happened in an instant, like someone had yanked the sound out of the room. Every head turned toward the large screen at the front of the lobby. A notification had appeared on its own. Their internal comms platform. The alert tone that only triggered for one person. Wind. Since they had started making this game, every person in that room had developed a genuine respect for him. Not just because he could produce rare items out of nowhere to use as in-game rewards, but because of how unervingly good he was as a developer. These were seasoned professionals. But every time they submitted work they were proud of, and the update actually went live, they would be caught completely off guard. The game's feel, its responsiveness, the depth of its systems, all of it would be noticeably better. 2, 3, 4 times better. There was only one explanation. Wind had been quietly putting in an enormous amount of work behind the scenes. So whenever a message from him showed up, everyone stopped what they were doing. Because it almost always meant they were about to learn something. Every person in the lobby held their breath. Dozens of eyes locked onto the screen. A single line of text appeared. Wind, you've all done great work. Rescue team's reception has gone beyond what I expected. The lobby exploded. Getting a compliment from Wind was already a big deal, something worth celebrating in its own right. Cheers bounced off the walls. A few people actually pumped their fists. But then the text kept coming. Wind, set rescue team aside for now. We're going to build something new. The cheering cut off. Every face in the room went blank. Set it aside? Rescue team's story wasn't even halfway done. There were unfinished levels, players demanding more content, momentum that felt unstoppable. And just like that, they were putting it on hold? And now they were starting a brand new game on top of that? Did this person's drive have a ceiling at all? They were still trying to process it when the next lines came through. Wind, this game will connect directly to the real world. It involves the ghost world. Below is a rough outline. I've already built a prototype, and the details need to be filled in by your team. I need it done as fast as possible. Time is short. Give it everything you've got. Silence settled over the room a second time. Connected to the real world? The ghost world? What in the world was he building? Chapter 292 The Brand, and it shipped? Hearing that name, a lot of people just went blank. Sure, some had caught wind of rumors about the ghost world, but that was ultimately a place only trainers ever paid attention to. For regular people, it was both mysterious and completely irrelevant to their lives. And yet, why the urgency? Their heads were full of questions, but nobody dared hesitate. They opened the compressed file immediately and started going through its contents. One by one, the files opened, and the expressions on their faces shifted dramatically. Blank confusion gave way to shock, and shock gave way to barely contained excitement. What the hell? This map, how was it even made? One of the artists on the map design team couldn't hold it together, pointing at the insanely detailed 3D model on his screen with trembling hands. Look at the lighting. The fog rendering. This looks more real than actual reality. How is that even possible? Wait, he's planning to convert real-world battles directly into in-game missions. No way that actually works. But if it does, won't that break everything? The lobby, previously dead quiet, erupted into chaos. These were professional game developers. They could see at a glance the sheer value packed into this framework. This wasn't just a game. This was an entirely new world. That electric feeling of watching two realities collide sent every single one of their hearts racing. They didn't even need to ask why, because they already knew, if this thing actually got built, it would go down as a landmark moment in gaming history. Enough talking. Why is everyone just standing around? Ren slammed his palm on the table and shot to his feet, his eyes sharp as a blade. Wind handed us something extraordinary. We are not dropping the ball on this. Everyone, follow my lead. Strategy team, start mapping out the mission logic right now. I want every single mission node accounted for. Programming team, get the interfaces connected. Zero latency in data transmission, not a frame of lag. Our team, pull up every asset library we have. Match this style and start filling in every model and texture. Move. Now. Yes sir. Everyone answered at once, voices sharp and energized. A second later, the entire lobby plunged back into that frenzied, full-throttle work mode. The sound of typing was faster and louder than before. Inside a private booth at a net cafe in Saffron City, Kairos let out a long, satisfied yawn, his joints popping all over as he stretched out. After sending the message, he'd already moved on. He trusted that team. Now that he'd handed them a solid framework like that, they'd come through. All he had to do was wait. Next up was the part he found both the most aggravating and the most exciting. The lottery. Kairos checked his remaining points. 50,000. An absolute fortune. He took a slow breath, settled into his chair, and quietly gave the command in his head. System, single draw. Confirming 500 points consumed. Drawing now. The wheel on the screen spun up fast, a dazzling blur of color that almost made his eyes cross. Kairos watched it with a flat expression. No matter how flashy the animation looked, luck wasn't something you could just will into existence. As the wheel gradually wound down, a flash of white light passed across the screen. Congratulations, host. Obtained, high-grade potion X10. Congratulations, host. Obtained, antidote X10. Congratulations, host. Obtained, full heal X5. A cluster of white light points drifted across the screen. Not a bad haul in terms of quantity, but all basic consumables. Kairos curled his lip. Exactly what he'd expected. Luck didn't just show up because you wanted it to. On second thought, though, while these items were useless to him personally, they'd be solid supplies for regular trainers. Especially in the brutal conditions of the ghost world, having extra recovery items on hand was genuinely worth something. 5,000 more. Consuming 5,000 points. Congratulations, host. Obtained, trademark Fire Blast X1. Congratulations, host. Obtained, trademark Thunderbolt X1. Congratulations, host. Obtained, SP. ATKF Booster X1. Now that was more like it. These TMS weren't the rarest pulls in the world, but their market value was high and their practical use was through the roof. Fire Blast and Thunderbolt in particular were the go-to high-power moves for fire and electric types. Half the trainers out there would kill to get their hands on them. Kairos relaxed a little, though his hands didn't stop moving. Keep going. 5,000 more. And so, in one long, unbroken session, he burned through nearly 20,000 points. The screen filled up fast with all kinds of items. Rare evolution stones, powerful TMS across a range of types, various resources, and friendship-boosting toys and accessories. No S-grade item had popped up to make his heart jump, and A-grade pulls were sparse, with the vast majority landing in the B and C tiers. But the sheer volume more than made up for it. This pile of items was basically a small armory. For trainers about to throw themselves headfirst into the ghost world, this was the ultimate temptation. Kairos looked over everything stacked in his inventory and felt a quiet confidence settle over him. That should do it. Even without pulling anything useful for himself, this batch of supplies was more than enough to stock the initial reward pool. Once the game went live and these rewards dropped in, it would set off a frenzy. He was just about to close the lottery screen and take a breather when a strange sensation suddenly flickered through the back of his mind. It was a weird feeling, almost like a pair of eyes watching him from somewhere. Kairos stopped what he was doing and focused. That feeling, had it been there since he left the ghost world earlier? He'd assumed it was just some after effect of the spatial transfer, or a psychological shadow left over from the ghost world's oppressive atmosphere. But thinking about it now, that didn't quite fit. This feeling was something else entirely. Kairos reached up instinctively and touched his chest. Something clicked. He opened the system panel and pulled up his character sheet. It didn't take long to find it. His gaze landed on the bottom left corner of the screen, a spot he never normally looked at. Where there should have been nothing, there was now a line of deep violet text. It looked like it had been written in blood, still twisting and shifting, giving off a faint, unsettling glow. Kairos's eyes went sharp, and his expression changed in an instant. Special status, Brand of Giratina, Lord of the Reverse World. Status description, you have been observed by the King of the Ruined World, and its power has left an indelible mark deep within your soul. Effect, this brand cannot be removed except by special means. While the brand persists, the bearer will receive 1 instance of protection from Giratina's power, capable of blocking a single lethal blow. However, Giratina may at any time, regardless of spatial distance, observe the brand bearer's precise location, descend directly to the brand bearer's side, or forcibly drag them into the reverse world. Warning: once the brand has persisted for 1 full month, the brand bearer will automatically be absorbed into the reverse world and become a permanent part of it, forbidden from ever leaving. Kairos stared at that line of dark violet text still twisting on the screen and stood frozen for a solid few seconds. So Marshadow had been telling the truth. That Giratina really wasn't anything remotely friendly. He'd figured that once the spiritum crisis in the ghost world was dealt with, that whole chapter would close. He never expected to end up tangled with something far worse. He definitely had no interest in joining any reverse world. Setting aside the fact that he'd seen firsthand what that place looked like, a permanent stay wasn't just inconvenient, it was outright terrifying. He'd been planning to head back to the ghost world once things settled down and ask Giratina for that feather, but that idea needed to get scrapped immediately. The less contact the better. Because if that thing got irritated for even a second and decided he was trying to run, it might just drag him into the reverse world ahead of schedule. Kairos rubbed his temples with a vague sense of dread creeping in. Why was this ghost dragon so dead set on getting him to join the reverse world? What exactly was it about him that the thing found worth fixating on? Either way, sitting here wondering about it wasn't going to solve anything. The immediate priority was to finish pulling rewards and get the ghost world situation sorted out. The notice said he had a full month before he'd be forcibly pulled in. A month. Not exactly generous, but not nothing either. Plenty of time to deal with the fire right in front of him first. As for the brand, he'd track down Marshadow later and have a talk, see if there was any way to handle it. With that sorted out in his head, Kairos gave a small shake and pushed the noise out of his mind, turning his attention back to the lottery screen. Keep going. He said it quietly, hit the wheel again, and the screen lit back up in a dizzying blur of color. Kairos watched it with the same flat expression, already braced for another wave of junk. But just as the wheel was about to stop, a blinding flash of gold tore free from the swirling colors and exploded across the entire screen. A golden orb? Kairos blinked, then understood immediately. It actually hit. As the orb slowly shattered, a stream of golden light poured into the system interface, and a line of glittering gold text materialized in the center of the screen. Congratulations, host! Obtained, S&D grade reward, purifier. Purifier? Kairos pulled up the item's description right away. Item name, purifier, single use. Item description, a remarkable device imbued with the power of absolute rules. It can remove any status condition from any target, including curses, poisons, parasitic effects, or brands left behind by legendary Pokémon. Usage restrictions, none. Special note, though this item's function is powerful, upon use it will automatically calculate the resources required based on the actual strength of the status conditions present on the target. If sufficient resources cannot be provided, the item cannot be used. After reading through it, Kairos's eyes went wide. This thing was made for his exact situation. Was this not basically designed to handle Giratina's brand directly? Single use, sure, but if it could defuse that ticking time bomb, once was more than enough. Kairos didn't hesitate for a second. He used it immediately. Use purifier. Target, the reverse world lord's brand. At his command, the purifier icon on the screen dissolved into a stream of light and disappeared into him. The system chime rang out again. Ding! Brand detected on target, brand of Giratina, lord of the reverse world. Analyzing removal difficulty. Analysis complete. Warning, this brand contains rule level power of legendary grade. Removal difficulty is extremely high. To forcibly remove this brand, the following must be consumed: Dragon type SS grade resource X1, Ghost type SS grade resource X1. The smile on Kairos's face stopped dead. What? 1 Dragon type SS grade resource and 1 Ghost type SS grade resource? He was floored. As far as he could remember, he hadn't so much as laid eyes on an SS grade resource yet. The highest grade items he had were a handful of S&D pulls from earlier draws, still a full tier short of what he needed. This was a genuine problem. He'd thought he'd pulled something incredible, something that would wipe the whole issue out in one shot. Apparently it really wasn't going to be that clean. Kairos let out a long, somewhat helpless sigh and closed the system panel. Fine. Panicking wasn't going to help. He still had well over a month. At least now he knew how to remove the brand, which was infinitely better than being completely in the dark. As long as he figured out another angle, or found a way to get his hands on those 2 SS-grade resources, he'd still have time to work with. For now, the priority was finishing the lottery and filling up the reward pool. With that settled, Kairos cleared his head and went back to pulling. Several hours slipped by in a blink. Inside the private booth in Saffron City, the sound of typing had long gone quiet. Kairos rolled his neck, working out the stiffness, and leaned back. The screen in front of him had the lottery interface closed, replaced by a dense list of items. After hours of grinding, he'd burned through half his 50,000 points. Nothing as wild as the purifier had shown up again in the meantime, but he'd stacked up a massive volume of A and B tier goods including rare evolution stones, high-level TMS, various resources, and a solid collection of friendship-boosting items. It was more than enough, not just for the Ghost World players, but for the other 3 games as well. Right then, the email icon in the lower right corner of the screen started blinking. Kairos opened it. A message from Ren. The subject line was 2 words, done. Chapter 293 Ghost World Hunter, Go's first player, Will. It looked like the team at Dream Factory had delivered. Their turnaround was way faster than anything he could have managed on his own. Kairos pulled out his phone and opened the attachment. As the program loaded, a beautifully designed game icon appeared at the center of the screen, a ghost symbol rendered in soft blue light, looking both mysterious and unmistakably high-tech. He double-tapped the icon and stepped into the game interface. After a few seconds of loading animation, his phone screen shifted to a simulated camera feed. Through the feed, the otherwise empty private room now had semi-transparent red dots blinking into existence out of nowhere, along with drifting shadows scattered across the space. These were system-generated test figures, built to demonstrate the AR effects. Kairos took his time going through every detail. The map rendering was sharp and immersive, with lighting and shadow work that nailed the suffocating atmosphere the Ghost World was known for. The radar was snappy too. The minimap in the corner updated in real time, tracking the positions of each ghost, and tapping any one of them brought up level breakdowns and weakness notes. What impressed him most, though, was how smooth the simulated combat felt. A light swipe of his finger sent the Pokémon on screen through a full run of dodging and attacking animations, each one carrying solid impact with 0 lag. The simulated combat feature wouldn't replace real battles, but it would give players a real edge going up against ghost-type Pokémon. Ren and his crew had come through. Both the speed and the quality were exactly what he'd hoped for. Kairos nodded, satisfied. He thought it over for a moment, then started typing his reply. In the email, he flagged a few minor things. The UI color palette was running a little dark and could get rough on the eyes during a long session, so he suggested brightening it up. He also recommended punching up the success effect, maybe throwing in some particle effects to give players a stronger hit of visual feedback. Once the email was done, he hit send. Kairos leaned back in his chair, glanced at the confirmation on screen, then switched over to the system panel. This was the critical step. Without integrating these 2 modules, the game would never actually connect to the real Ghost World. That link was what would turn live Ghost-type Pokémon data into in-game mission targets, and allow the simulated combat system to pull from real interactions and generate the most accurate player and Pokémon data possible. The loading process was fast, and the modifications went through without a hitch. He took a breath. Next up was the final release. But there was still one loose end. Issuing missions to players was covered by the second module through the matching system, and the combat simulation and tutorials were solid, but reward distribution still had to be handled manually on his end. The modules just didn't have that built in. He rubbed the back of his neck. With the Ghost World's population, that alone would be an enormous amount of work. But maybe there was a module for it. He opened the system panel again and ran a search. Sure enough, there was another mid-tier module sitting right there, purpose-built to match players with real-world rewards. 2,000 points. He grabbed it without hesitation and loaded it in. At that point, Ghost World Hunter was ready to go live. But before the official launch, there was one more thing he needed to take care of. Kairos scrolled through his special characters list and pulled up Will, the Ghost World Lord he had just met. He'd run the game through its paces on him first. While Kairos went about all of this with a fairly relaxed hand, the mood inside the Ghost World's main tower at that exact moment was something else entirely. The conference room was wide but dim, the kind of circular space where sound bounced off every wall and made everything louder than it needed to be. The air was stale, threaded with the faint smell of old cigarettes and frayed nerves. Every seat around the long table was filled, but this was no unified command. It looked more like a standoff that hadn't technically started yet. Several tower masters in grey robes were pounding the table, faces flushed, voices climbing over each other in a way that was going nowhere fast. This is completely unreasonable. Things are this bad, and the Alliance has only delivered 30% of what they promised? What are we supposed to hold the line with? The one speaking was a gaunt, hollow-eyed man, the tower master overseeing the western defensive front. He hadn't slept properly in days, and it showed. The West has always taken the worst of the ghost activity. Some tilt in our direction is more than fair. But I went through the list, and the high-grade healing supplies that came down this time went mostly to the east. On what grounds? Are the lives of people on the western front worth less to them? The tower master across from him, a heavier-set man, held his ground without flinching. The east sits right up against the core zone. The pressure there is nothing like what you're dealing with. If we don't get enough resources, the line collapses. Besides, the Alliance is stretched thin right now. Disasters are popping up everywhere, and the fact that they sent anything at all is more than most people would have managed. And you're still pushing for more. Right. Stretched thin. Sounds more like someone's been scheming to me. Watch your mouth. Back that up. You want proof? Look at what the Bounty Guild is paying out lately. The same subjugation missions are offering double the reward they used to. If the official compensation wasn't so pitiful, who in their right mind would volunteer for missions like that? Trainers aren't fools. They go where the money is. We've been bleeding people, and you're going to sit there and pretend you haven't noticed. The back and forth kept going, round after round, each person convinced they'd been dealt the worst hand and deserved the most. They blamed each other, pointed fingers at the Alliance, and circled back to their own grievances without ever landing on a single useful idea. Will, seated at the head of the table, said nothing. His hands were folded under his chin, and he stared with distant, unfocused eyes at the people arguing in front of him. As the strongest person in the Ghost World faction and the de facto leader among the World Lords, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, genuine helplessness. These people had no idea what they were actually up against. They were still fighting over medicine bottles and energy blocks, still maneuvering for whatever scraps of advantage they could grab. If the thing sealed deep in the core ever actually broke free, if that old nightmare became real, none of this would matter. Not the resources, not the arguments, not the alliances. Every single person in this room would be gone. All of it, for nothing. Will let his eyelids drop slightly, and a wave of exhaustion moved through him, threaded with something close to shame. What had he been doing these past few years? Since taking on the role of World Lord, he had poured everything into his own advancement, obsessed with pushing through to the legendary tier, telling himself that if he just got strong enough, he could face down any threat and keep the Ghost World intact. And what did he have to show for it? His neglect had let the Ghost World faction rot from the inside out. People this short-sighted, this selfing, had risen into positions of real power, and now here they were. The Ghost World was like a piece of wood that looked solid until you pressed on it. All surface, nothing underneath. He couldn't help thinking back to what Kairos had said on his way out. That guy always talked like nothing was a big deal, but there was something underneath the words, a kind of quiet certainty that had stuck with Will. He had said things would change. He had said the Ghost World's situation would get better. Looking at the room in front of him now, Will had a hard time seeing how. With these people? This group that could spend half a day screaming at each other over a few bottles of medicine? He pushed the thought away. Sitting here stewing wouldn't help anything. If no one else was going to step up, then he would handle it himself. Will made a quiet decision. If things truly fell apart beyond any hope of recovery, then so be it. He would do what several of his predecessors had done before him, pour his own life into the seal, burn himself out to buy a little more time. It wouldn't fix anything. But it would give the outside world a window, however small. Even if it cost him everything. Thinking it through, what he felt wasn't really fear. It was closer to a tired kind of calm. Maybe this had always been where the role of World Lord ended up. He had taken the title and everything that came with it. Giving his life at the end of the line was just the debt coming due. And yet, even still, he couldn't shake a quiet, nagging sense of loss. He had believed he was genuinely strong. Believed he had pushed himself as far as anyone in this world could go. But looking at where things stood, it clearly hadn't been enough. That so-called legendary tier had always sat just out of reach, like a wall with no door in it. No matter how hard he pushed, he had never once caught a glimpse of the other side. While Will sat with those thoughts, the argument around the table showed no sign of winding down. If anything, it was getting louder. One tower master who had barely said a word the whole meeting, his expression cold and tight, turned his attention squarely toward Will. "I have to ask, Lord Will. Do you have anything to add?" The room went quiet instantly. Most of the people there were carrying grievances, but not many would have had the nerve to say that out loud. The words were polite enough on their face. The message underneath was not. "You're the world lord. Shouldn't you be doing something? What exactly is sitting there in silence supposed to accomplish?" Eyes moved uneasily toward the tower master who had spoken, then drifted up toward Will at the head of the table. Two others exchanged a sideways glance, their faces unreadable. Under the circumstances, they did need Will to weigh in. He had never been big on that kind of thing, but there was no getting around it now. He had gone dark for a stretch not long ago, and now that he had finally shown up to this meeting, he hadn't said a single word the entire time. The tower master had said what the room was thinking. The other two didn't move to stop it. They just waited to see what Will would do. Will paused. He pulled himself back to the present and raised his head. His eyes moved across the room. The weight of a champion-class fighter radiated off him in an instant, and every person at the table felt it land on them like a hand closing around their chest. The tower master who had just spoken went pale. Sweat broke across his forehead, and his hands trembled. He did not say anything else. Will looked at those faces, full of fear and greed and careful calculation, and the disappointment he had been holding settled into something final. This was the backbone of the Ghost World faction. These were the people he had been putting everything on the line to protect. What a sorry state of affairs. He was about to open his mouth, either to dress them down or just call the whole thing off, when something flickered at the edge of his vision. A semi-transparent window appeared in the air in front of him, materializing out of nothing. The design was clean and modern, its edges traced with a faint, steady blue glow that cut sharply through the low light of the conference room. Will went completely still. What was that? Before he could even begin to sort it out, the text on the window had already resolved clearly in front of him. A high-value target has been detected. Would you like to accept a game invitation? A game invitation. The image of a young man surfaced in his mind without him meaning to call it up. He had said things would change. He had said there would be a way. And apparently he had meant it. Though this wasn't quite what Will had pictured. He had expected reinforcements, maybe. Some outside force capable of shifting the balance. Not a window floating in the middle of the air. A game window, at that. He also had no idea how it had ended up directly in his line of sight. He reached out instinctively, but his hand passed through empty air. The thing seemed to be projected straight into his vision somehow. Will raised an eyebrow. If Kairos had put it there, it wasn't a joke. Without hesitating, he thought, yes. The window expanded immediately, spreading across his entire field of vision. Invitation accepted. Target confirmed. Congratulations. You are the first player of Ghost World Hunter, go. Chapter 294. Is this game a bit too outrageous? Loading game module. Binding real-world data. Load complete. Will felt a flash of light before his eyes, and the conference room around him vanished instantly, replaced by a deep and mysterious starry sky. At the center of that starry expanse, a breathtaking cinematic cutscene began to play. In the footage, the once peaceful and tranquil ghost world was suddenly swallowed by a dark force, as countless frenzied ghost-type Pokémon surged from the shadows, destroying towns and attacking innocent Pokémon. Just as a sense of despair began to spread, figures cloaked in capes stepped forward one by one. With Pokeballs in hand and resolve in their eyes, they threw themselves into a desperate battle against those terrifying wraiths. As the fighting wore on, those hunters' figures grew ever more imposing, their radiance converging until at last it dispersed the darkness and restored light to the ghost world. At the very end of the scene, several large characters appeared. Save the shattered world, and become the true king of hunters. The entire animation lasted barely a minute, yet whether it was the stunning detail of the visuals or the overwhelming sense of epic grandeur that washed over him, Will couldn't help raising an eyebrow. This was a game? The sense of immersion was so complete it was as if he had truly been standing on that battlefield himself. And that whole concept of the ghost world hunter identity. Save the world, become stronger. That did sound genuinely appealing, he had to admit. Will couldn't deny it, judging by this opening cutscene alone, the changes Iono had mentioned actually had some substance to them. But, exciting as it was, Will's cool head immediately brought him back to the most critical issue at hand. No matter how polished the packaging, no matter how extravagant the pitch, this was still just a game at its core. And what was the ghost world facing right now? War. A crisis of life and death. If you wanted trainers to willingly throw themselves into the ghost world to risk their lives, a few slogans and a flashy cutscene simply weren't going to cut it. Without sufficient rewards, who in their right mind would do something so reckless? The bounty hunters who were still holding on were doing so purely because of the hefty pay. If this game couldn't offer better returns than the Bounty Guild, then it was nothing more than a distraction, and it had absolutely no chance of changing the current situation. Will shook his head inwardly, just about to check what other features the game had to offer. It was at that moment that a new line of text popped up. This game uses a real-world mission system. Players can accept missions, defeat infected ghost-type Pokémon within the ghost world, and earn game points. Points note: game points can not only be used to raise your in-game character level, but also be directly exchanged in the game shop for rare real-world items, DMS, and various precious resources. Reading that line, Will froze completely. What? Exchange directly for real-world rewards? How could things from inside a game end up in reality? This utterly overturned everything he thought he knew. If this was actually real. Before he could even recover from the shock, the window flickered again. Player Will detected as a high-value target. Issuing one new player welcome gift. In the next instant, Will felt his palm grow heavy. A crystal radiating a rich, dark aura materialized out of thin air in his hand. The crystal was no bigger than a thumb, jet black throughout, yet deep within it, something resembling a constantly flickering flame seemed to be sealed away, emitting an unsettling pulse of terrifying energy. As Will sensed the pure, powerful force contained within the crystal, his pupils contracted sharply, and even his breathing grew ragged. This was a soul crystal. And judging by its color and purity, the quality was absurdly high. This thing was an absolute treasure, even for a champion-level trainer like him. Ghost-type Pokémon that absorbed a high-purity soul crystal like this could not only dramatically boost their power, there was even a chance they'd comprehend new psychic manipulation moves. Items like this were essentially priceless on the open market. Even as the domain master, getting his hands on a piece of this quality took enormous effort and no small amount of luck. And yet, this thing had just appeared in his hands this effortlessly, and it was only supposed to be a welcome gift? Just then, the shadow beneath Will's feet suddenly rippled violently. A Gengar, wreathed in a purple-black aura, emerged from the shadow, staring at the soul crystal in Will's hand and letting out a low growl. Gengar. It was clearly drawn in completely by the thing's allure. His Gengar was usually the composed, steady type, yet its reaction was that intense. So it was the real deal. If even a Pokémon at his Gengar's level couldn't resist the temptation, that said everything about how genuinely valuable this reward was. If ordinary trainers found out that playing a game could earn them something like this, would they lose their minds? At that point, forget hunting monsters on the outer edges of the ghost world. If someone told them to charge into the core zone and fight that thing to the death, there'd probably be people actually considering it. However, just as Will was about to examine the crystal more closely, it suddenly transformed into a beam of black light and dove straight into the game window, vanishing. Welcome gift has been stored in the system inventory. It can be retrieved after completing the beginner's mission. Now then, Hunter. Let us depart. Staring at the provocative words on the screen, Will paused, then quickly put it together. Of course nothing this valuable came without a catch. That would have been too good to be true. And given how generous the reward was, the mission difficulty was sure to be no joke either. Will took a deep breath and looked ahead. The window that had been displaying the starry sky and animation was slowly fading away, replaced by a refined, semi-transparent map interface. On that map, a dense cluster of red dots and green markers were annotated in detail, with each dot showing the level, combat assessment, and weakness analysis of its corresponding target. This didn't look like a game interface at all. It looked more like a real-time tactical command map of the entire Ghost World, and one far clearer and more detailed than the outdated command system his own Ghost World faction used. As Will took in everything before him, his heart, which had been weary and adrift, now began to pound with an unfamiliar urgency. He thought he could see a glimmer of hope. A glimmer of hope that might actually lead the ghost world out of this darkness. Never imagined it would come down to something like this in the end. Will let out a rueful laugh, then his gaze hardened with resolve. Whatever the case, now that this thing existed, he absolutely could not let it go to waste. Try it first and see how it performs. If it really worked, then the ghost world this time might actually have a chance. Will took a deep breath, adjusted his posture, and refocused his eyes on the semi-transparent game window. Now that the decision was made, he had to see just how capable this so-called system really was. With a single thought, the starry background on the interface dissolved in an instant, replaced by cascading streams of rapidly flowing data, and then a pale blue beam shot out from the screen and gently enveloped Will's entire body. There was no discomfort whatsoever, it actually felt like a cool current sweeping through him from head to toe, as though he were undergoing a comprehensive physical scan. Scanning player status. Reading data. Champion level trainer detected. Compiling detailed profile. A few seconds later, the beam slowly retracted, and a dense stream of information appeared on the screen. Will looked carefully, and his pupils narrowed ever so slightly. What was displayed here wasn't just his basic information, like height and weight, but more critically, it had listed the status of every single Pokémon he was carrying. And the level of detail was almost obscene. It wasn't just surface-level data like level, nature, and ability. It had even documented each Pokémon's current minor physical ailments, recent emotional fluctuations, and potential values that Will himself would need precision instruments to measure. Take his Gengar. The system showed that its psychic energy is in a state of mild agitation, and the probability of comprehending a new move in the near future has increased by 20%. Will couldn't help raising an inward eyebrow at that. Why was this thing able to gather such detailed information about him, including things he didn't even know himself? It seemed the earlier notification hadn't been exaggerating at all, this game really was linked to real-world data. Please set your lead battle Pokémon. Please select your combat style. Cautious, aggressive, or balanced. The screen shifted to show 3 options. Will looked at them, brow furrowing slightly as he fell into thought. His lead Pokémon was an easy choice, Gengar was his strongest, so who else would it be? But this combat style setting gave him pause. This wasn't just a simple game setting. This was clearly a sorting mechanism designed for different types of trainers. Will understood all too well what the Ghost World's situation looked like right now. The trainers who had come from the outside, though they all claimed to be there to help, varied wildly in quality. Some were naturally timid and hesitated at the first sign of risk. Others were pure thrill seekers who charged ahead without a second thought. And then there were those who preferred measured, calculated tactics. Forcing all 3 types into the same squad to carry out a mission was nothing short of a disaster. The timid ones would drag everyone down, the reckless ones would get themselves killed, coordination was simply impossible. And in the chaos of a battlefield like this, sorting through everyone one by one and reorganizing them was extraordinarily costly in time and manpower. But now, this feature had resolved that biggest headache outright. As long as the system matched people to missions and teammates based on their chosen style, it was the most efficient organizational structure imaginable. Will gave a quiet nod of approval. This game really had thought of everything. Since he was just doing a test run, he'd start by seeing what the logic behind cautious mode actually looked like. Will reached out, tapped Gengar on the screen as his lead, then selected cautious. Player's selection of cautious style detected. System assessment, player favors stable combat and avoids high-risk situations. Searching for a suitable mission. Target identified. No other players currently online. Single player hunting mission assigned. Will blinked. There were group missions too? Since no one else was online right now, solo it was. Immediately after, a detailed profile card popped up. Target, Bayonet, Elite 4 Peak. Known moves, Shadow Ball, Feint Attack, Curse, Destiny Bond, Shadow Claw. Weaknesses, Dark Type, Ghost Type, Speed-oriented Pokémon, powerful single-target special attacks. Current status, Frenzied, Mild, Psychic Energy Unstable, Aggressive Intent High. Location, Ghost World Outer Zone, Sector B, Abandoned Ruins. Looking at that data, Will was struck with another jolt of surprise. An Elite 4 Peak Bayonet? That was serious fighting power, without question. Under normal circumstances, hunting something at that level would require at least 2 elite squads, and you'd still need to brace for casualties. Yet in this system, that was considered a beginner mission suited to the cautious style? Right, of course. It seemed the system's difficulty assessment was calibrated entirely to his own strength as a champion-level trainer. Just then, the screen shifted again. A massive, three-dimensional holographic map of the ghost world appeared before him. The map was extraordinarily detailed, even the contours of the terrain and the distribution of trees were clearly visible. Before Will could take a proper look, the map began to rapidly zoom in, ultimately locking onto a small red dot near the edge. That was the bayonet's location. A beat later, a blue dotted line extended from Will's position, pointing straight toward that red dot. Navigation activated. Please proceed along the designated route. Will studied the route carefully, and the more he looked, the more unsettled he felt. This wasn't some simple navigation path. This was a perfectly optimized route, the product of precise calculation. Not only had the path been calculated to avoid every known high-level ghost Pokémon's territory and skirt the poisonous miasma swamps, but even a seemingly safe stretch of flatland had been flagged with a yellow exclamation mark. Warning: a fog burst will occur in this area in approximately 2 minutes. Please wait here until the fog disperses before proceeding. Will stared at that notification, utterly dumbfounded. He was the domain master of the ghost world and knew this place like the back of his hand, yet even he couldn't necessarily calculate things that precisely, or know in advance that a specific area would develop fog in exactly 2 minutes. This game knew the ghost world better than he did, its own native. How absurdly outrageous was this thing, exactly? If it could reach into reality and place treasure in a man's hand, knowing every shadow of the ghost world was simply the least of what it could do. Chapter 295 Absurd Rewards and Points. Will's mission. Come to think of it, given his level of strength, he could easily slip into Jengar's shadow and phase right through, without having to worry about any of those spirits or the haze. But Will had developed a strange curiosity about this game. He wanted to know, if he followed its guidance completely, walking step by step like an ordinary player, what kind of result would that actually produce? So he pushed aside any thought of teleporting, stood up, and followed the route displayed on the screen, moving one step at a time. All along the way, Will behaved like an obedient student doing exactly as he was told. When the system said to veer left, he didn't take a single step to the right. When the game told him to stop and wait 2 minutes, he stood there in place, staring blankly into the air for the full 2 minutes. The result took him completely by surprise. Just as he rounded a large boulder, a massive nightshade spirit suddenly materialized from the air and slammed down on the exact spot he should have been passing through moments ago. Had he not taken the detour, he would have been caught dead on, though to be fair, with his level of strength, it wouldn't have been much of a problem regardless. Then there was the moment he waited out the haze surge. Barely a minute after he stopped, a dense wave of deep violet-black mist suddenly churned up across the road ahead. The Soulbane fog was extraordinarily thick, even he would probably have been in for a rough time walking through it. 2 minutes later, the fog miraculously dispersed, and the path ahead became clear once again. Will stood where he was, watching all of it unfold before him, and what he felt wasn't simply surprise anymore, it was a deep, visceral shock. He had come all this way without taking a single scratch. For him personally, the detour was completely unnecessary, but for visiting trainers from outside, and for his own people of the ghost world lineage, it was anything but trivial. This level of guidance could genuinely help them avoid unnecessary physical strain and even casualties. One of the biggest problems his people faced when carrying out missions inside the ghost world was that the extreme complexity of certain regions, combined with dangers that could appear at any moment, often drained them almost completely before a mission even began. And now, with direct guidance from the game, it was as though each of them had been assigned an omniscient tactical advisor, those problems could be avoided entirely. Even so, what came next surprised him even more. As he continued forward, a semi-transparent simulation window suddenly popped up in the lower right corner of the screen. Detected, player approaching target. Combat simulation data loaded. Combat simulation mode now active. Available to assist player in formulating battle tactics. Will looked closely, and inside the window, a miniaturized battle scene had appeared. On one side was his Jengar, on the other was that Elite 4-level bayonet. The visuals were simulated, but the bayonet's movements, its expression, and even the wild, oppressive aura radiating off its body were identical to the real thing. Will spoke toward the screen experimentally. Jengar, use Shadow Ball. The words barely left his mouth when the Jengar in the simulation immediately condensed a sphere of black energy and hurled it straight at the bayonet. The simulated bayonet reacted with blinding speed. Its body dissolved into a cloud of black mist and dodged the attack entirely, then countered immediately with a dazzling gleam. Will watched every detail with perfect clarity. This was a simulation built entirely around that bayonet's real combat habits. In an actual battle, Jengar would very likely have been disrupted by that, assuming the gap in strength was comparable. Will adjusted immediately, use Will-O-Wisp to cut it off. The Jengar in the simulation immediately breathed out a pale blue flame and positioned it directly in front of itself. Sure enough, just as the bayonet lunged out from the shadows, it was driven back by the ghostly fire. The back and forth felt completely real, as though an actual battle was being fought. What was even more extraordinary was that the simulation could be rewound at any moment. If he mishandled a move, Will could reset back to that point instantly and try a different response. There was even a battle assist option on the side of the window. When Will opened it, it had already generated several recommendations. Caution, bayonet is preparing to use Destiny Bond. Immediately use a switching technique or swap your Pokémon. Recommended tactic, exploit Jengar's speed advantage to open with an attrition-based approach, bait out the opponent's Destiny Bond, then move in for the finish. Note, a significant power gap has been detected. Your Pokémon could release a large burst of Ghost-type energy to counter the Destiny Bond effect upon defeating the opponent. However, to conserve stamina for subsequent missions, the previous tactic is recommended. Reading those clear, well-structured recommendations, Will felt the corners of his mouth begin to curve upward. This was practically a handheld guide on how to win. In battle, aside from raw strength, experience was everything. The standard by which a trainer's ability was judged could often be read directly from the depth of their battle experience. The older and stronger the trainer, the richer their accumulated knowledge of combat. And now, for an ordinary trainer, even one with modest natural talent, having something like this to compensate for their lack of battle experience could allow them to perform at several times their actual level. Will stopped walking and stared at the still flickering simulation window, feeling a storm rise inside him. For him, right now, only one thing truly mattered. If this game could actually deliver on its promise and hand out rewards capable of changing reality once a mission was completed, then the coming battle to protect the Ghost World might genuinely have nothing to do with his Ghost World lineage at all. All those outside trainers would need to do was have this game, and they would become a supremely coordinated force, one that knew the Ghost World inside out. In gaming terms, what was that called again? A cheat, wasn't it? Will drew a slow breath and forced his emotions back down. For as long as he could remember, he had felt like he was fighting alone on the matter of the Ghost World, or more precisely, that only those of the Ghost World lineage were truly giving everything to protect the seal. Others came to help, but in the end it was always for their own benefit, including the League. But now, when the benefits were staggering enough, it no longer mattered whether they were helping out of genuine conviction. As long as the outcome was good, that was enough. Right, the rewards. That new player welcome gift had already included a soul stone of incredible quality. So what kind of rewards could actually be exchanged with mission completion points? Kairos had to be bold to bring something like this out. The items in the shop were almost certainly even more outrageous. With that thought, Will began hunting through the interface. Sure enough, in the upper right corner, he spotted an icon glowing with golden light, the points shop. Without any hesitation, Will tapped his way in. The next moment, he froze. Was this some kind of wishing well? The shop listings were packed tight and sprawling in every direction, with a variety far beyond anything he had imagined. But there wasn't a single piece of filler. Everything listed was a genuinely useful, high-quality item. And the prices, weren't they a bit too low? Take this, for instance. Full restore, 1 point per bottle. This item instantly restores all of a Pokémon's HP and cures any status conditions. Recommended maximum use, once per day, excessive use will reduce its effectiveness. The recovery effect described here sounded even more absurd than the entire batch of medicine the League had sent to support them, and a single bottle only cost 1 point? He immediately scrolled down through the rest of the list. Sure enough, all manner of bizarre and extraordinary items were there, along with materials and rare medicinal herbs he had only ever read about in ancient texts. And if the points were sufficient, even a soul stone of the same quality as the one he had just received could be exchanged here. A soul stone at that tier, only 35 points. Will's gaze swept quickly across the listings until it landed on a pale blue candy icon. Rare candy, basic A candy filled with mysterious energy. When fed to a Pokémon, it directly enhances a portion of their strength. Exchange cost, 50 points. The moment Will read that description, his breath caught. Directly enhance strength? If someone had walked up to him before today, held this up, and insisted it was real, he would have thrown them out on the spot without a second thought, and probably wondered whether they had lost their mind. But now, Will instinctively glanced at Gengar beside him, then back at the still flickering simulation window. The precise navigation earlier, the combat simulation that could foresee what was coming, all of it was more than enough to prove the scale of power behind this game. If all of that was possible, then a candy capable of enhancing a Pokémon's strength was actually quite easy to accept. Will drew a slow breath and opened the candy's full detail page. When he reached the notes section at the bottom, however, his eyes dimmed slightly. Note: effective only on Pokémon below Elite 4 tier. As expected. Will shook his head with a wry look. Breaking through to that level, it was never going to be that simple. But just as he was about to close the page and scroll further down, his gaze caught on a different icon in the column beside it. It read, Rare Candy, Intermediate, ... Will's pulse jumped. He tapped it open immediately. Rare Candy, Intermediate A candy filled with even more concentrated mysterious energy. When fed to a Pokémon, it directly enhances a portion of their strength. The description was almost identical to the basic version, but when he looked at the notes section below, something was missing. There was no line reading effective only on Pokémon below Elite 4 tier. Will stared at that blank notes field, and the realization hit him instantly. No restrictions. This meant the intermediate candy would be effective even when given to an Elite 4 tier Pokémon, or even a Champion Tier 1. He checked the exchange cost immediately, 200 points. 4 times the price of the basic version. But it was obviously worth every point. The most pressing matter was to finish the task ahead and see whether he could earn some points. He closed the shop interface and shifted his attention back to the world around him. The frenzied Bayonet was drifting nearby, the terrifying aura rolling off its body making the air around it feel cold enough to cut through to the bone. Clearly it had been affected by the Soulbane fog. An Elite 4 tier frenzied ghost Pokémon was a formidable opponent by any measure. But in Will's eyes, it was nothing to worry about. Gengar, let's go. His voice was quiet. The shadow behind him twisted, and Gengar's purple form floated free, its crimson eyes glowing with an eerie light in the dim reaches of the ghost world. The Bayonet across from them quickly sensed the presence of an intruder and let out a piercing, grating shriek. The bandages wrapped all over its body exploded outward, and it hurled itself forward like a creature gone completely mad. Will spoke again, Gengar, use Will-O-Wisp. Gengar didn't hesitate for a second. Its jaws opened wide, and a rush of pale blue fire surged forth, landing precisely along the Bayonet's line of approach. The Bayonet, wild as it was, still had enough instinct left to stop dead. It had no desire to be touched by those flames, which were known to sear the soul itself. As it stumbled backward, Will's next command came. Fake a shadow ball, just to draw it out. Gengar raised both arms immediately, black energy gathering rapidly between its palms, everything about it suggesting an attack was about to be unleashed. The Bayonet still had enough battle instinct intact to recognize the threat. The moment it saw Gengar's stance, it sensed danger. A look of vicious cunning flashed through those sly eyes, it dropped low, and the shadows directly beneath its feet suddenly lit up with a strange, unsettling glow. That was the sign of Destiny Bond activating. Will had been watching its every move without blinking, and rather than surprise, what he felt in that moment was something close to calm certainty, exactly as expected. The instant that patch of pitch-black shadow beneath the Bayonet's feet spread and reached Gengar's, a bizarre force connected the two Pokémon. This was Destiny Bond, the ghost-type move that gives strategists the most headaches. Its effect was brutally unfair. For as long as the move remained active, if the user took a fatal blow or went down, the opponent would suffer the exact same damage and fall alongside them. It was a curse that crossed power levels entirely. While an overwhelming gap in strength could prevent both from going down together, it could still deal devastating damage regardless of the disparity. It doesn't matter if you are 10 times stronger than your opponent, or if you can flatten them with a single strike, the moment you defeat them while Destiny Bond is active, you pay a price for it. For many trainers with raw power but limited experience, this move was the perfect tool for catching them completely off guard. More often than not, they would land a one-hit knockout and be celebrating before realizing with confusion that their own Pokémon had somehow just taken a heavy wound. However, this move had one critical weakness. Its window was extraordinarily short. The bond established by Destiny Bond held for only an instant. If that instant passed without the effect being triggered, the connection immediately broke, and the move was spent. For experienced trainers who saw it coming, all it took was a feint or a defensive maneuver to bait it out, and then they could handle things at their leisure. Exactly like now.
Additionally, if you would like to request novels and access my Google Drive where I have 200+ audiobooks, then you can join my Patreon. Link is also provided in the description.